Chapter 22 of Sister Carrie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bob Sage. Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. Chapter 22. The Blaze of the Tinder. Flesh wars with the flesh. The misfortune of the Hurstwood household was due to the fact that jealousy, having been born of love, did not perish with it. Mrs. Hurstwood retained this in such form that subsequent influences could transform it into hate. Hurstwood was still worthy, in a physical sense, of the affection his wife had once bestowed upon him, but in a social sense he fell short. With his regard died his power to be attentive to her, and this, to a woman, is much greater than outright crime toward another. Our self-love dictates our appreciation of the good or evil in another. In Mrs. Hurstwood it discolored the very hue of her husband's indifferent nature. She saw design in deeds and phrases which sprung only from faded appreciation of her presence. As a consequence, she was resentful and suspicious. The jealousy that prompted her to observe every falling away from the little amenities of the married relation on his part served to give her notice of the airy grace with which he still took the world. She could see from the scrupulous care which he exercised in the matter of his personal appearance that his interest in life had abated not a jot. Every motion, every glance, had something in it of the pleasure he felt in Carrie, of the zest this new pursuit of pleasure lent to his days. Mrs. Hurstwood felt something, sniffing change, as animals do danger, afar off. This feeling was strengthened by actions of a direct and more potent nature on the part of Hurstwood. We have seen with what irritation he shirked those little duties which no longer contained any amusement or satisfaction for him, and the open snarls with which, more recently, he resented her irritating goads. These little rows were really precipitated by an atmosphere which was surcharged with dissension. That it would shower with a sky so full of blackening thunder clouds would scarcely be thought worthy of comment. Thus, after leaving the breakfast table this morning, raging inwardly at his blank declaration of indifference to her plans, Mrs. Hurstwood encountered Jessica in her dressing room, very leisurely arranging her hair. Hurstwood had already left the house. "I wish you wouldn't be so late coming down to breakfast," she said, addressing Jessica, while making for her crochet basket. "Now, here the things are quite cold, and you haven't eaten." Her natural composure was sadly ruffled, and Jessica was doomed to feel the fag end of the storm. "I'm not hungry," she answered. "Then why don't you say so, and let the girl put away the things instead of keeping her waiting all morning?" "She doesn't mind," answered Jessica coolly. "Well, I do, if she doesn't," returned the mother. "And anyhow, I don't like you to talk that way to me. You're too young to put on such an air with your mother." "Oh, Mama, don't row," answered Jessica. "What's the matter this morning, anyway?" "Nothing's the matter, and I'm not rowing. You must think because I indulge you in some things that you can keep everybody waiting. I won't have it." "I'm not keeping anybody waiting," returned Jessica sharply, stirred out of a cynical indifference to a sharp defense. "I said I wasn't hungry. I don't want breakfast." "Mind how you address me, Missy. I'll not have it. Hear me now. I'll not have it." Jessica heard this last while walking out of the room with a toss of her head and a flick of her pretty skirts, indicative of the independence and indifference she felt. She did not propose to be quarreled with. Such little arguments were all too frequent, and the result of a growth of natures which were largely independent and selfish. George Jr. manifested even greater touchiness and exaggeration in the matter of his individual rights, and attempted to make all feel that he was a man with a man's privileges, an assumption which, of all things, is most groundless and pointless in a youth of 19. Hurstwood was a man of authority and some fine feeling, and it irritated him excessively to find himself surrounded more and more by a world upon which he had no hold, and of which he had a lessening understanding. Now, when such little things, such as the proposed earlier start to Waukesha, came up, they made clear to him his position. He was being made to follow, was not leading. When in addition a sharp temper was manifested, and to the process of shouldering him out of his authority was added a rousing intellectual kick, such as a sneer or a cynical laugh, he was unable to keep his temper. He flew into hardly repressed passion and wished himself clear of the whole household. It seemed a most irritating drag upon all his desires and opportunities. For all this, he still retained the semblance of leadership and control, even though his wife was straining to revolt. Her display of temper and open assertion of opposition were based upon nothing more than the feeling that she could do it. She had no special evidence wherewith to justify herself. The knowledge of something which would give her both authority and excuse, the latter was all that was lacking, however, to give a solid foundation to what, in a way, seemed groundless discontent. The clear proof of one overt deed was the cold breath needed to convert the lowering clouds of suspicion into a rain of wrath. An inkling of untoward deeds on the part of Hurstwood had come. Dr. Beale, the handsome resident physician of the neighborhood, met Mrs. Hurstwood at her own doorstep some days after Hurstwood and Carrie had taken the drive west on Washington Boulevard. Dr. Beale, coming east on the same drive, had recognized Hurstwood, but not before he was quite past him. He was not so sure of Carrie, did not know whether it was Hurstwood's wife or daughter. "You don't speak to your friends when you meet them driving, do you?" he said jocosely to Mrs. Hurstwood. "If I see them, I do. Where was I?" "On Washington Boulevard," he answered, expecting her eye to light with immediate remembrance. She shook her head. "Yes, out near Hoyne Avenue. You were with your husband." "I guess you're mistaken," she answered. Then, remembering her husband's part in the affair, she immediately fell a prey to a host of young suspicions, of which, however, she gave no sign. "I know I saw your husband," he went on. "I wasn't so sure about you. Perhaps it was your daughter." "Perhaps it was," said Mrs. Hurstwood, knowing full well that such was not the case, as Jessica had been her companion for weeks. She had recovered herself sufficiently to wish to know more of the details. "Was it in the afternoon?" she asked, artfully assuming an air of acquaintanceship with the matter. "Yes, about 2 or 3. "It must have been Jessica," said Mrs. Hurstwood, not wishing to seem to attach any importance to the incident. The physician had a thought or two of his own, but dismissed the matter as worthy of no further discussion, on his part at least. Mrs. Hurstwood gave this bit of information considerable thought during the next few hours and even days. She took it for granted that the doctor had really seen her husband, and that he had been riding, most likely, with some other woman, after announcing himself as busy to her. As a consequence, she recalled with rising feeling how often he had refused to go places with her, to share in little visits, or indeed take part in any of the social amenities which furnished the diversion of her existence. He had been seen at the theater with people whom he called Moy's friends. Now he was driving, and most likely would have an excuse for that. Perhaps there were others of whom she did not hear, or why should he be so busy, so indifferent of late? In the last 6 weeks he had become strangely irritable, strangely satisfied to pick up and go out, whether things were right or wrong in the house. Why? She recalled, with more subtle emotions, that he did not look at her now with any of the old light of satisfaction or approval in his eye. Evidently, along with other things, he was taking her to be getting old and uninteresting. He saw wrinkles, perhaps. She was fading, while he was still preening himself in his elegance and youth. He was still an interested factor in the merrymakings of the world, while she— But she did not pursue the thought. She only found the whole situation bitter, and hated him for it thoroughly. Nothing came of this incident at the time, for the truth is, it did not seem conclusive enough to warrant any discussion. Only the atmosphere of distrust and ill-feeling was strengthened, precipitating every now and then little sprinklings of irritable conversation, enlivened by flashes of wrath. The matter of the Waukesha outing was merely a continuation of other things of the same nature. The day after Carrie's appearance on the Avery stage, Mrs. Hurstwood visited the races with Jessica and a youth of her acquaintance, Mr. Bart Taylor, the son of the owner of a local house-furnishing establishment. They had driven out early, and as it chanced, encountered several friends of Hurstwood, all Elks, and two of whom had attended the performance the evening before. 1,000 chances the subject of the performance had never been brought up, had Jessica not been so engaged by the attentions of her young companion, who usurped as much time as possible. This left Mrs. Hurstwood in the mood to extend the perfunctory greetings of some who knew her into short conversations, and the short conversations of friends into long ones. It was from one who meant but to greet her perfunctorily that this interesting intelligence came. "I see," said this individual, who wore sporting clothes of the most attractive pattern, and had a field-glass strung over his shoulder, "that you did not get over to our little entertainment last evening." "No?" said Mrs. Hurstwood inquiringly, and wondering why he should be using the tone he did in noting the fact that she had not been to something she knew nothing about. It was on her lips to say, "What was it?" when he added, "I saw your husband." Her wonder was at once replaced by the more subtle quality of suspicion. "Yes," she said cautiously. "Was it pleasant? He did not tell me much about it." "Very. Really one of the best private theatricals I have ever attended. There was one actress who surprised us all." "Indeed," said Mrs. Hurstwood. "It's too bad you couldn't have been there, really. I was sorry to hear you weren't feeling well." Feeling well. Mrs. Hurstwood could have echoed the words after him open-mouthed. As it was, she extricated herself from her mingled impulse to deny and question, and said, almost raspingly, "Yes, it's too bad." "Looks like there will be quite a crowd here today, doesn't it?" the acquaintance observed, drifting off upon another topic. The manager's wife would have questioned further, but she saw no opportunity. She was for the moment wholly at sea, anxious to think for herself and wondering what new deception was this, which caused him to give out that she was ill when she was not. Another case of her company not wanted, and excuses being made. She resolved to find out more. "Were you at the performance last evening?" she asked the next of Hurstwood's friends who greeted her as she sat in her box. "Yes, you didn't get around." "No," she answered. "I was not feeling very well." "So your husband told me," he answered. "Well, it was really very enjoyable. Turned out much better than I expected." "Were there many there?" "Ah, the house was full. It was quite an elk night. I saw quite a number of your friends, Mrs. Harrison, Mrs. Barnes, Mrs. Collins. Quite a social gathering. Indeed it was. My wife enjoyed it very much." Mrs. Hurstwood bit her lip. So, she thought, that's the way he does. Tells my friends I'm sick and cannot come. She wondered what could induce him to go alone. There was something back of this. She rummaged her brain for a reason. By evening, when Hurstwood reached home, she had brooded herself into a state of sullen desire for explanation and revenge. She wanted to know what this particular action of his imported. She was certain there was more behind it all than what she had heard, and evil curiosity mingled well with distrust and the remnants of her wrath of the morning. She, impending disaster itself, walked about with gathered shadow at the eyes and the rudimentary muscles of savagery fixing the hard lines of her mouth. On the other hand, as we may well believe, the manager came home in the sunniest mood. His conversation and agreement with Carrie had raised his spirits until he was in the frame of mind of one who sings joyously. He was proud of himself, proud of his success, proud of Carrie. He could have been genial to all the world, and he bore no grudge against his wife. He meant to be pleasant, to forget her presence, to live in the atmosphere of youth and pleasure which had been restored to him. So now the house, to his mind, had a most pleasing and comfortable appearance. In the hall he found an evening paper, laid there by the maid and forgotten by Mrs. Hurstwood. In the dining room, the table was clean laid with linen and napery and shiny with glasses and decorated china. Through an open door he saw into the kitchen, where the fire was crackling in the stove and the evening meal already well under way. Out in the small backyard was George Jr. frolicking with a young dog he had recently purchased, and in the parlor Jessica was playing at the piano, the sound of a merry waltz filling every nook and corner of the comfortable house. Everyone, like himself, seemed to have regained his good spirits, to be in sympathy with youth and beauty, to be inclined to joy and merrymaking. He felt as if he could say a good word all around himself, and took a most genial glance at the spread table and polished sideboard before going upstairs to read his paper in the comfortable armchair of the sitting room, which looked through the open windows into the street. When he entered there, however, he found his wife brushing her hair and musing to herself the while. He came lightly in, thinking to smooth over any feelings that might still exist by a kindly word and a ready promise, but Mrs. Hurstwood said nothing. He seated himself in the large chair, stirred lightly in making himself comfortable, opened his paper, and began to read. In a few moments he was smiling merrily over a very comical account of a baseball game which had taken place between the Chicago and Detroit teams. The while he was doing this, Mrs. Hurstwood was observing him casually through the medium of the mirror which was before her. She noticed his pleasant, contented manner, his airy grace and smiling humor, and it merely aggravated her the more. She wondered how he could think to carry himself so in her presence after the cynicism, indifference, and neglect he had heretofore manifested and would continue to manifest so long as she would endure it. She thought how she should like to tell him, what stress and emphasis she would lend her assertions, how she could drive over this whole affair until satisfaction should be rendered her. Indeed, the shining sword of her wrath was but weakly suspended by a thread of thought. In the meanwhile, Hurstwood encountered a humorous item concerning a stranger who had arrived in the city and become entangled with a bunco steerer. It amused him immensely, and at last he stirred and chuckled to himself. He wished that he might enlist his wife's attention and read it to her. "Ha ha!" he exclaimed softly as if to himself. "That's funny." Mrs. Hurstwood kept on arranging her hair, not so much as deigning a glance. He stirred again and went on to another subject. At last he felt as if his good humor might find some outlet. Julia was probably still out of humor over that affair of this morning, but that could easily be straightened. As a matter of fact, she was in the wrong, but he didn't care. She could go to Waukesha right away if she wanted to. The sooner the better. He would tell her that as soon as he got a chance and the whole thing would blow over. "Did you notice," he said at last, breaking forth concerning another item which he had found, "that they have entered suit to compel the Illinois Central to get off the lakefront, Julia?" he asked. She could scarcely force herself to answer, but managed to say "no" sharply. Hurstwood pricked up his ears. There was a note in her voice which vibrated keenly. "It would be a good thing if they did," he said, half to himself, half to her, though he felt that something was amiss in that quarter. He withdrew his attention to his paper very circumspectly, listening mentally for the little sounds which should show him what was on foot. As a matter of fact, no man as clever as Hurstwood, as observant and sensitive to atmospheres of many sorts, particularly upon his own plane of thought, would have made the mistake which he did in regard to his wife, wrought up as she was, had he not been occupied mentally with a very different train of thought. Had not the influence of Carrie's regard for him, the elation which her promise aroused in him, lasted over, he would not have seen the house in so pleasant a mood. It was not extraordinarily bright and merry this evening. He was merely very much mistaken, and would have been much more fitted to cope with it had he come home in his normal state. After he had studied his paper a few moments longer, he felt that he ought to modify matters in some way or other. Evidently his wife was not going to patch up peace at a word, so he said, "Where did George get that dog he has there in the yard?" "I don't know," she snapped. He put his paper down on his knees and gazed idly out of the window. He did not propose to lose his temper, but merely to be persistent and agreeable, and by a few questions bring around a mild understanding of some sort. "Why do you feel so bad about the affair this morning?" he said at last. "We needn't quarrel about that. You know you can go to Waukesha if you want to." "So you can stay here and trifle around with someone else?" she exclaimed, turning to him in a determined countenance upon which was drawn a sharp and wrathful sneer. He stopped as if slapped in the face. In an instant his persuasive conciliatory manner fled. He was on the defensive at a wink, and puzzled for a word to reply. "What do you mean?" he said at last, straightening himself and gazing at the cold, determined figure before him, who paid no attention, but went on arranging herself before the mirror. "You know what I mean," she said finally, as if there were a world of information which she held in reserve, which she did not need to tell. "Well, I don't," he said stubbornly, yet nervous and alert for what should come next. The finality of the woman's manner took away his feeling of superiority in battle. She made no answer. "Humph," he murmured, with a movement of his head to one side. It was the weakest thing he had ever done. It was totally unassured. Mrs. Hurstwood noticed the lack of color in it. She turned upon him, animal-like, able to strike an effectual second blow. "I want the Waukesha money tomorrow morning," she said. He looked at her in amazement. Never before had he seen such a cold, steely determination in her eye, such a cruel look of indifference. She seemed a thorough master of her mood, thoroughly confident and determined to wrest all control from him. He felt that all his resources could not defend him. He must attack. "What do you mean?" he said, jumping in. "You want? I'd like to know what's got into you tonight." "Nothing's got into me," she said, flaming. "I want that money. You can do your swaggering afterwards." "Swaggering, eh? What? You'll get nothing from me. What do you mean by your insinuations, anyway?" "Where were you last night?" she answered. The words were hot as they came. "Who were you driving with on Washington Boulevard? Who were you with at the theater when George saw you? Do you think I'm a fool to be duped by you? Do you think I'll sit at home here and take your two-busies and can't come, while you parade around and make out that I'm unable to come? I want you to know that lordly airs have come to an end, so far as I'm concerned. You can't dictate to me, nor my children. I'm through with you, entirely." "It's a lie," he said, driven to a corner, and knowing no other excuse. "Lie, eh?" she said fiercely, but with returning reserve. "You may call it a lie if you want to, but I know." "It's a lie, I tell you," he said in a low, sharp voice. "You've been searching around for some cheap accusation for months, and now you think you have it. You think you'll spring something and get the upper hand. Well, I tell you, you can't. As long as I'm in this house, I'm master of it, and you or anyone else won't dictate to me. Do you hear?" He crept toward her with a light in his eye that was ominous. Something in the woman's cool, cynical, upper-handish manner, as if she were already master, caused him to feel for a moment that he could strangle her. She gazed at him, a pythoness in humor. "I'm not dictating to you," she returned. "I'm telling you what I want." The answer was so cool, so rich in bravado, that somehow it took the wind out of his sails. He could not attack her. He could not ask her for proofs. Somehow he felt evidence, law, the remembrance of all his property which she held in her name to be shining in her glance. He was like a vessel, powerful and dangerous, but rolling and floundering without sail. "And I'm telling you," he said in the end, slightly recovering himself, "what you'll not get." "We'll see about it," she said. "I'll find out what my rights are. Perhaps you'll talk to a lawyer, if you won't talk to me." It was a magnificent play, and it had its effect. Hurstwood fell back beaten. He knew now that he had more than mere bluff to contend with. He felt that he was face to face with a dull proposition. What to say he hardly knew. All the merriment had gone out of the day. He was disturbed, wretched, resentful. What should he do? "Do as you please," he said at last. "I'll have nothing more to do with you." And out he strode. End of chapter 22. Recording by Bob Sage. Chapter 23 of Sister Carrie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bob Sage. Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. Chapter 23. A Spirit in Travail, One Rung Put Behind. When Carrie reached her room, she had already fallen prey to those doubts and misgivings which are ever the result of a lack of decision. She could not persuade herself as to the advisability of her promise, or that now, having given her word, she ought to keep it. She went over the whole ground in Hurstwood's absence, and discovered little objections that had not occurred to her in the warmth of the manager's argument. She saw where she had put herself in a peculiar light, namely, that of agreeing to marry when she was already supposedly married. She remembered a few things Drouet had done, and now that it came to walking away from him without a word, she felt as if she were doing wrong. Now she was comfortably situated, and to one who is more or less afraid of the world, this is an urgent matter, and one which puts up strange, uncanny arguments. You do not know what will come. There are miserable things outside. People go a-begging. Women are wretched. You never can tell what happened. Remember the time you were hungry? Stick to what you have. Curiously, for all her leaning toward Hurstwood, he had not taken a firm hold on her understanding. She was listening, smiling, approving, and yet not finally agreeing. This was due to a lack of power on his part, a lack of that majesty of passion that sweeps the mind from its seat and fuses and melts all arguments and theories into a tangled mass and destroys for the time being the reasoning power. This majesty of passion is possessed by nearly every man once in his life, but it is usually an attribute of youth and conduces to the first successful mating. Hurstwood, being an older man, could scarcely be said to retain the fire of youth, though he did possess a passion warm and unreasoning. It was strong enough to induce the leaning toward him which, on Carrie's part, we have seen. She might have been said to be imagining herself in love when she was not. Women frequently do this. It flows from the fact that in each exists a bias towards affection, a craving for the pleasure of being loved. The longing to be shielded, bettered, sympathized with, is one of the attributes of the sex. This, coupled with sentiment and a natural tendency to emotion, often makes refusing difficult. It persuades them that they are in love. Once at home, she changed her clothes and straightened the room for herself. In the matter of the arrangement of the furniture, she never took the housemaid's opinion. That young woman invariably put one of the rocking chairs in the corner, and Carrie as regularly moved it out. Today she hardly noticed that it was in the wrong place, so absorbed was she in her own thoughts. She worked about the room until Drouet put in an appearance at 5 o'clock. The drummer was flushed and excited and full of determination to know all about her relations with Hurstwood. Nevertheless, after going over the subject in his mind the livelong day, he was rather weary of it and wished it over with. He did not foresee serious consequences of any sort, and yet he rather hesitated to begin. Carrie was sitting by the window when he came in, rocking and looking out. "Well," she said innocently, weary of her own mental discussion and wondering at his haste and ill-concealed excitement, "what makes you hurry so?" Drouet hesitated, now that he was in her presence, uncertain as to what course to pursue. He was no diplomat. He could neither read nor see. "When did you get home?" he asked foolishly. "Oh, an hour or so ago. What makes you ask that?" "You weren't here," he said, "when I came back this morning, and I thought you had gone out." "So I did," said Carrie simply. "I went for a walk." Drouet looked at her wonderingly. For all his lack of dignity in such matters, he did not know how to begin. He stared at her in the most flagrant manner until at last she said, "What makes you stare at me so? What's the matter?" "Nothing," he answered. "I was just thinking." "Thinking about what?" she returned smilingly, puzzled by his attitude. "Oh, nothing. Nothing much." "Well then, what makes you look so?" Drouet was standing by the dresser, gazing at her in a comic manner. He had laid off his hat and gloves, and was now fidgeting with the toilet pieces which were nearest him. He hesitated to believe that the pretty woman before him was involved in anything so unsatisfactory to himself. He was very much inclined to feel that it was all right after all. Yet the knowledge imparted to him by the chambermaid was rankling in his mind. He wanted to plunge in with a straight remark of some sort, but he knew not what. "Where did you go this morning?" he asked finally, weakly. "Why, I went for a walk," said Carrie. "Sure you did?" he asked. "Yes. What makes you ask?" She was beginning to see now that he knew something. Instantly she drew herself into a more reserved position. Her cheeks blanched slightly. "I thought maybe you didn't," he said, beating around the bush in the most useless manner. Carrie gazed at him, and as she did so her ebbing courage halted. She saw that he himself was hesitating, and with a woman's intuition realized that there was no occasion for great alarm. "What makes you talk like that?" she asked, wrinkling her pretty forehead. "You act so funny tonight." "I feel funny," he answered. They looked at one another for a moment, and then Drouet plunged desperately into his subject. "What's this about you and Hurstwood?" he asked. "Me and Hurstwood? What do you mean?" "Didn't he come here a dozen times while I was away?" "A dozen times?" repeated Carrie guiltily. "No, but what do you mean?" "Somebody said that you went out riding with him, and that he came here every night." "No such thing," answered Carrie. "It isn't true. Who told you that?" She was flushing scarlet to the roots of her hair, but Drouet did not catch the full hue of her face, owing to the modified light of the room. He was regaining much confidence as Carrie defended herself with denials. "Well, someone," he said. "You're sure you didn't?" "Certainly," said Carrie. "You know how often he came." Drouet paused for a moment and thought. "I know what you told me," he said finally. He moved nervously about while Carrie looked at him confusedly. "Well, I know that I didn't tell you any such thing as that," said Carrie, recovering herself. "If I were you," went on Drouet, ignoring her last remark, "I wouldn't have anything to do with him. He's a married man, you know." "Who? Who is?" said Carrie, stumbling at the word. "Why, Hurstwood," said Drouet, noting the effect and feeling that he was delivering a telling blow. "Hurstwood?" exclaimed Carrie, rising. Her face had changed several shades since this announcement was made. She looked within and without herself in a half-dazed way. "Who told you this?" she asked, forgetting that her interest was out of order and exceedingly incriminating. "Why, I don't know. I've always known it," said Drouet. Carrie was feeling about for a right thought. She was making a most miserable showing, and yet feelings were generating within her which were anything but crumbling cowardice. "I thought I told you," he added. "No, you didn't," she contradicted, suddenly recovering her voice. "You didn't do anything of the kind." Drouet listened to her in astonishment. This was something new. "I thought I did," he said. Carrie looked around her very solemnly and then went over to the window. "You oughtn't to have had anything to do with him," said Drouet in an injured tone, "after all I've done for you." "You?" said Carrie. "You? What have you done for me?" Her little brain had been surging with contradictory feelings. Shame at exposure, shame at Hurstwood's perfidy, anger at Drouet's deception, the mockery he had made of her. Now, one clear idea came into her head. He was at fault. There was no doubt about it. Why did he bring Hurstwood out? Hurstwood, a married man, and never say a word to her? Never mind now about Hurstwood's perfidy. Why had he done this? Why hadn't he warned her? There he stood now, guilty of this miserable breach of confidence, and talking about what he had done for her. "Well, I like that!" exclaimed Drouet, little realizing the fire his remark had generated. "I think I've done a great deal." "You have, huh?" she answered. "You've deceived me, that's what you've done. You've brought your friends out here under false pretenses. You've made me out to be... Oh!" And with this her voice broke, and she pressed her two little hands together tragically.
"I don't see what that's got to do with it," said the drummer quaintly. "No," she answered, recovering herself and shutting her teeth. "No, of course you don't see. There isn't anything you see. You couldn't have told me in the first place, could you? You had to make me out wrong until it was too late. Now you come sneaking around with your information and your talk about what you have done." Drouet had never suspected this side of Carrie's nature. She was alive with feeling, her eyes snapping, her lips quivering, her whole body sensible of the injury she felt and partaking of her wrath. "Who's sneaking?" he asked, mildly conscious of an error on his part, but certain that he was wronged. "You are," stamped Carrie. "You're a horrid, conceited coward. That's what you are. And if you had any sense of manhood in you, you wouldn't have thought of doing any such thing." The drummer stared. "I'm not a coward," he said. "What do you mean by going with other men, anyway?" "Other men!" exclaimed Carrie. "Other men! You know better than that. I did go with Mr. Hurstwood, but whose fault was it? Didn't you bring him here? You told him yourself that he should come out here and take me out. Now, after it's all over, you come and tell me that I oughtn't to go out with him and that he's a married man?" She paused at the sound of the last two words and wrung her hands. The knowledge of Hurstwood's perfidy wounded her like a knife. "Oh," she sobbed, repressing herself wonderfully and keeping her eyes dry. "Oh, oh." "Well, I didn't think you'd be running around with him when I was away," insisted Drouet. "Didn't think?" said Carrie, now angered to the core by the man's peculiar attitude. "Of course not. You thought only of what would be to your satisfaction. You thought you'd make a toy of me, a plaything. Well, I'll show you that you won't. I'll have nothing more to do with you at all. You can take your old things and keep them." And unfastening a little pin he had given her, she flung it vigorously upon the floor and began to move about as if to gather up the things which belonged to her. By this Drouet was not only irritated, but fascinated the more. He looked at her in amazement, and finally said, "I don't see where your wrath comes in. I've got the right of this thing. You oughtn't to have done anything that wasn't right after all I did for you." "What have you done for me?" asked Carrie, blazing, her head thrown back and her lips parted. "I think I've done a good deal," said the drummer, looking around. "I've given you all the clothes you wanted, haven't I? I've taken you everywhere you wanted to go. You've had as much as I've had, and more, too." Carrie was not ungrateful, whatever else might be said of her. Insofar as her mind could construe, she acknowledged benefits received. She hardly knew how to answer this, and yet her wrath was not placated. She felt that the drummer had injured her irreparably. "Did I ask you to?" she returned. "Well, I did it," said Drouet, "and you took it." "You talk as if I'd persuaded you," answered Carrie. "You stand there and throw up what you've done. I don't want your old things. I'll not have them. You take them tonight and do what you please with them. I'll not stay here another minute." "That's nice," he answered, becoming angered now at the sense of his own approaching loss. "Use everything and abuse me and then walk off. That's just like a woman. I take you when you haven't got anything, and then, when someone else comes along, why, I'm no good. I always thought it'd come out this way." He felt really hurt as he thought of his treatment, and looked as if he saw no way of obtaining justice. "It's not so," said Carrie, "and I'm not going with anybody else. You have been as miserable and inconsiderate as you can be. I hate you, I tell you. I wouldn't live with you another minute. You're a big, insulting—" Here she hesitated and used no word at all. "Or you wouldn't talk that way." She secured her hat and jacket and slipped the latter on over her little evening dress. Some wisps of wavy hair had loosened from the bands at the side of her head and were straggling over her hot red cheeks. She was angry, mortified, grief-stricken. Her large eyes were full of the anguish of tears, but her lids were not yet wet. She was distracted and uncertain, deciding and doing things without an aim or conclusion, and she had not the slightest conception of how the whole difficulty would end. "Well, that's a fine finish," said Drouet. "Pack up and pull out, eh? You take that cake. I bet you were knocking around with Hurstwood, or you wouldn't act like that. I don't want the old rooms. You needn't pull out for me. You can have them for all I care, but George, you haven't done me right." "I'll not live with you," said Carrie. "I don't want to live with you. You've done nothing but brag around ever since you've been here." "Oh, I haven't anything of the kind," he answered. Carrie walked over to the door. "Where are you going?" he said, stepping over and heading her off. "Let me out," she said. "Where are you going?" he repeated. He was above all sympathetic, and the sight of Carrie wandering out, he knew not where, affected him, despite his grievance. Carrie merely pulled at the door. The strain of the situation was too much for her, however. She made one more vain effort, and then burst into tears. "Now, be reasonable, Cad," said Drouet gently. "What do you want to rush out for this way? You haven't any place to go. Why not stay here now and be quiet? I'll not bother you. I don't want to stay here any longer." Carrie had gone sobbing from the door to the window. She was so overcome she could not speak. "Be reasonable now," he said. "I don't want to hold you. You can go if you want to, but why don't you think it over? Lord knows I don't want to stop you." He received no answer. Carrie was quieting, however, under the influence of his plea. "You stay here now, and I'll go," he added at last. Carrie listened to this with mingled feelings. Her mind was shaken loose from the little mooring of logic that it had. She was stirred by this thought, angered by that, her own injustice, Hurstwood's, Drouet's, the respective qualities of kindness and favor, the threat of the world outside in which she had failed once before, the impossibility of this state inside, where the chambers were no longer justly hers, the effect of the argument upon her nerves, all combined to make her a mass of jangling fibers, an anchorless, storm-beaten little craft which could do absolutely nothing but drift. "Say," said Drouet, coming over to her after a few moments with a new idea and putting his hand upon her. "Don't," said Carrie, drawing away, but not removing her handkerchief from her eyes. "Never mind about this quarrel now. Let it go. You stay here until the month's out anyhow, and then you can tell better what you want to do, eh?" Carrie made no answer. "You'd better do that," he said. "There's no use packing up now. You can't go anywhere." Still, he got nothing for his words. "If you'll do that, we'll call it off for the present, and I'll get out." Carrie lowered her handkerchief slightly and looked out the window. "Will you do that?" he asked. Still no answer. "Will you?" he repeated. She only looked vaguely into the street. "Ah, come on," he said. "Tell me, will you?" "I don't know," said Carrie softly, forced to answer. "Promise me you'll do that," he said, "and we'll quit talking about it. It'll be the best thing for you." Carrie heard him, but she could not bring herself to answer reasonably. She felt that the man was gentle, and that his interest in her had not abated, and it made her suffer a pang of regret. She was in a most helpless plight. As for Drouet, his attitude had been that of the jealous lover. Now, his feelings were a mixture of anger at deception and sorrow at losing Carrie, misery at being defeated. He wanted his rights in some way or other, and yet his rights included the retaining of Carrie, the making her feel her error. "Will you?" he urged. "Well, I'll see," said Carrie. This left the matter as open as before, but it was something. It looked as if the quarrel would blow over, if they could only get some way of talking to one another. Carrie was ashamed, and Drouet aggrieved. He pretended to take up the task of packing some things in a valise. Now, as Carrie watched him out of the corner of her eye, certain sound thoughts came into her head. He had erred, true, but what had she done? He was kindly and good-natured for all his egotism. Throughout this argument he had said nothing very harsh. On the other hand, there was Hurstwood, a greater deceiver than he. He had pretended all this affection, all this passion, and he was lying to her all the while. Oh, the perfidy of men! And she had loved him. There could be nothing more in that quarter. She could see Hurstwood no more. She would write him and let him know what she thought. Thereupon, what would she do? Here were these rooms. Here was Drouet, pleading for her to remain. Evidently, things could go on here somewhat as before, if all were arranged. It would be better than the street, without a place to lay her head. All this she thought of as Drouet rummaged the drawers for collars and labored long and painstakingly at finding a shirt stud. He was in no hurry to rush this matter. He felt an attraction to Carrie which would not down. He could not think that the thing would end by his walking out of the room. There must be some way round, some way, to make her own up that he was right and she was wrong, to patch up a peace and shut out Hurstwood forever. Mercy, how he turned at the man's shameless duplicity. "Do you think," he said, after a few moments' silence, "that you'll try and get on the stage?" He was wondering what she was intending. "I don't know what I'll do yet," said Carrie. "If you do, maybe I can help you. I've got a lot of friends in that line." She made no answer to this. "Don't go and try and knock around now without any money. Let me help you," he said. "It's no easy thing to go on your own hook here." Carrie only rocked back and forth in her chair. "I don't want you to go up against a hard game that way." He bestirred himself about some other details, and Carrie rocked on. "Why don't you tell me all about this thing," he said after a time, "and let's call it off. You don't really care for Hurstwood, do you?" "Why do you want to start on that again?" said Carrie. "You were to blame." "No, I wasn't," he answered. "Yes, you were," said Carrie. "You shouldn't have ever told me such a story as that." "But you didn't have much to do with him, did you?" went on Drouet, anxious for his own peace of mind to get some direct denial from her. "I won't talk about it," said Carrie, pained at the quizzical turn the peace argument had taken. "What's the use of acting like that now, Cad?" insisted the drummer, stopping in his work and putting up a hand expressively. "You might let me know where I stand at least." "I won't," said Carrie, feeling no refuge but in anger. "Whatever happened is your own fault." "Then do you care for him?" said Drouet, stopping completely and experiencing a rush of feeling. "Oh, stop," said Carrie. "Well, I'll not be made a fool of," exclaimed Drouet. "You may trifle around with him if you want to, but you can't lead me. You can tell me or not, just as you want to, but I won't fool any longer." He shoved the last few remaining things he had laid out into his valise and snapped it with a vengeance. Then he grabbed his coat, which he had laid off to work, picked up his gloves, and started out. "You can go to the deuce as far as I'm concerned," he said, as he reached the door. "I'm no sucker." And with that, he opened it with a jerk and closed it equally vigorously. Carrie listened at her window view, more astonished than anything else at this sudden rise of passion in the drummer. She could hardly believe her senses, so good-natured and tractable had he invariably been. It was not for her to see the wellspring of human passion. A real flame of love is a subtle thing. It burns as a will-o'-the-wisp, dancing onward to fairylands of delight. It roars as a furnace. Too often, jealousy is the quality upon which it feeds. End of chapter 23. Recording by Bob Sage.
Chapter 24 of Sister Carrie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carrie Bradfield. Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. Chapter 24. Ashes of Tinder, A Face at the Window. That night, Hurstwood remained downtown entirely, going to the Palmer house for a bed after his work was through. He was in a fevered state of mind, owing to the blight his wife's action threatened to cast upon his entire future. While he was not sure how much significance might be attached to the threat she had made, he was sure that her attitude, if long continued, would cause him no end of trouble. She was determined, and had worsted him in a very important contest. How would it be from now on? He walked the floor of his little office, and later that of his room, putting one thing and another together to no avail. Mrs. Hurstwood, on the contrary, had decided not to lose her advantage by inaction. Now that she had practically cowed him, she would follow up her work with demands, the acknowledgment of which would make her word law in the future. He would have to pay her the money which she would now regularly demand, or there would be trouble. It did not matter what he did. She really did not care whether he came home any more or not. The household would move along much more pleasantly without him, and she could do as she wished without consulting anyone. Now she proposed to consult a lawyer and hire a detective. She would find out at once just what advantages she could gain. Hurstwood walked the floor, mentally arranging the chief points of his situation. She has that property in her name, he kept saying to himself. What a fool trick that was! Curse it! What a fool move that was! He also thought of his managerial position. If she raises a row now, I'll lose this thing. They won't have me around if my name gets in the papers. My friends, too. He grew more angry as he thought of the talk any action on her part would create. How would the papers talk about it? Every man he knew would be wondering. He would have to explain and deny and make a general mark of himself. Then Moy would come and confer with him, and there would be the devil to pay. Many little wrinkles gathered between his eyes as he contemplated this, and his brow moistened. He saw no solution of anything, not a loophole left. Through all of this, thoughts of Carrie flashed upon him, and the approaching affair of Saturday. Tangled as all his matters were, he did not worry over that. It was the one pleasing thing in this whole rout of trouble. He could arrange that satisfactorily, for Carrie would be glad to wait, if necessary. He would see how things turned out tomorrow, and then he would talk to her. They were going to meet as usual. He saw only her pretty face and neat figure, and wondered why life was not arranged so that such joy as he found with her could be steadily maintained. How much more pleasant it would be. Then he would take up his wife's threat again, and the wrinkles and moisture would return. In the morning he came over from the hotel and opened his mail, but there was nothing in it outside the ordinary run. For some reason he felt as if something might come that way, and was relieved when all the envelopes had been scanned and nothing suspicious noticed. He began to feel the appetite that had been wanting before he had reached the office, and decided before going out to the park to meet Carrie to drop in at the Grand Pacific and have a pot of coffee and some rolls. While the danger had not lessened, it had not as yet materialized, and with him no news was good news. If he could only get plenty of time to think, perhaps something would turn up. Surely, this thing would not drift along to catastrophe and he not find a way out. His spirits fell, however, when, upon reaching the park, he waited, and Carrie did not come. He held his favorite post for an hour or more, then arose and began to walk around restlessly. Could something have happened out there to keep her away? Could she have been reached by his wife? Surely not. So little did he consider Drouet that it never once occurred to him to worry about his finding out. He grew restless as he ruminated, and then decided that perhaps it was nothing. She had not been able to get away this morning. That was why no letter notifying him had come. He would get one today. It would probably be on his desk when he got back. He would look for it at once. After a time he gave up waiting and drearily headed for the Madison car. To add to his distress, the bright blue sky became overcast with little fleecy clouds which shut out the sun. The wind veered to the east, and by the time he reached his office, it was threatening to drizzle all afternoon. He went in and examined his letters, but there was nothing from Carrie. Fortunately, there was nothing from his wife, either. He thanked his stars that he did not have to confront that proposition just now when he needed to think so much. He walked the floor again, pretending to be in an ordinary mood, but secretly troubled beyond the expression of words. At 1:30 he went to Rector's for lunch, and when he returned, a messenger was waiting for him. He looked at the little chap with a feeling of doubt. "I'm to bring an answer," said the boy. Hurstwood recognized his wife's writing. He tore it open and read without a show of feeling. It began in the most formal manner and was sharply and coldly worded throughout. "I want you to send the money I asked for at once. I need it to carry out my plans. You can stay away if you want to. It doesn't matter in the least. I must have some money, so don't delay, but send it by the boy." When he had finished it, he stood holding it in his hands. The audacity of the thing took his breath. It roused his ire also, the deepest element of revolt in him. His first impulse was to write but 4 words in reply: "Go to the devil." But he compromised by telling the boy that there would be no reply. Then he sat down in his chair and gazed without seeing, contemplating the result of his work. What would she do about that, the confounded wretch? Was she going to try to bulldoze him into submission? He would go up there and have it out with her. That's what he would do. She was carrying things with too high a hand. These were his first thoughts. Later, however, his old discretion asserted itself. Something had to be done. A climax was near, and she would not sit idle. He knew her well enough to know that when she had decided upon a plan, she would follow it up. Possibly matters would go into a lawyer's hands at once. "Damn her," he said softly, with his teeth firmly set. "I'll make it hot for her if she causes me trouble. I'll make her change her tone if I have to use force to do it." He arose from his chair and went and looked out into the street. The long drizzle had begun. Pedestrians had turned up collars and trousers at the bottom. Hands were hidden in the pockets of the umbrella-less. Umbrellas were up. The street looked like a sea of round black cloth roofs, twisting, bobbing, moving. Trucks and vans were rattling in a noisy line, and everywhere men were shielding themselves as best they could. He scarcely noticed the picture. He was forever confronting his wife, demanding of her to change her attitude toward him before he worked her bodily harm. At 4 o'clock another note came, which simply said that if the money was not forthcoming that evening, the matter would be laid before Fitzgerald and Moy on the morrow, and other steps would be taken to get it. Hurstwood almost exclaimed out loud at the insistency of this thing. Yes, he would send her the money. He'd take it to her. He would go up there and have a talk with her, and that at once. He put on his hat and looked around for his umbrella. He would have some arrangement of this thing. He called a cab and was driven through the dreary rain to the north side. On the way his temper cooled as he thought of the details of the case. What did she know? What had she done? Maybe she'd got hold of Carrie. Who knows? Or Drouet. Perhaps she really had evidence and was prepared to fell him as a man does another from secret ambush. She was shrewd. Why should she taunt him this way unless she had good grounds? He began to wish that he had compromised in some way or other, that he had sent the money. Perhaps he could do it up here. He would go in and see, anyhow. He would have no row. By the time he reached his own street, he was keenly alive to the difficulties of his situation, and wished over and over that some solution would offer itself, that he could see his way out. He alighted and went up the steps to the front door, but it was with a nervous palpitation of the heart. He pulled out his key and tried to insert it, but another key was on the inside. He shook at the knob, but the door was locked. Then he rang the bell. No answer. He rang again, this time harder. Still no answer. He jangled it fiercely several times in succession, but without avail. Then he went below. There was a door which opened under the steps into the kitchen, protected by an iron grating intended as a safeguard against burglars. When he reached this, he noticed that it was also bolted, and that the kitchen windows were down. What could it mean? He rang the bell and then waited. Finally, seeing that no one was coming, he turned and went back to his cab. "I guess they've gone out," he said apologetically to the individual who was hiding his red face in a loose tarpaulin raincoat. "I saw a young girl up in that winder," returned the cabby. Hurstwood looked, but there was no face there now. He climbed moodily into the cab, relieved and distressed. So this was the game, was it? Shut him out and make him pay? Well, by the Lord, that did beat all. End of chapter 24. Recording by Carrie Bradfield, St. Louis, Missouri.
Chapter 25 of Sister Carrie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carrie Bradfield. Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. Chapter 25. Ashes of Tinder, the Loosing of Stays. When Hurstwood got back to his office again, he was in a greater quandary than ever. Lord, Lord, he thought, what had he got into? How could things have taken such a violent turn, and so quickly? He could hardly realize how it had all come about. It seemed a monstrous, unnatural, unwarranted condition which had suddenly descended upon him without his let or hindrance. Meanwhile, he gave a thought now and then to Carrie. What could be the trouble in that quarter? No letter had come, no word of any kind, and yet here it was late in the evening, and she had agreed to meet him that morning. Tomorrow they were to have met and gone off. Where? He saw that in the excitement of recent events he had not formulated a plan upon that score. He was desperately in love, and would have taken great chances to win her under ordinary circumstances. But now what? Supposing she had found out something? Supposing she, too, wrote him and told him all that she knew, that she would have nothing more to do with him? It would be just like this to happen as things were going now. Meanwhile, he had not sent the money. He strolled up and down the polished floor of the resort, his hands in his pockets, his brow wrinkled, his mouth set. He was getting some vague comfort out of a good cigar, but it was no panacea for the ill which affected him. Every once in a while he would clench his fingers and tap his foot, signs of the stirring mental process he was undergoing. His whole nature was vigorously and powerfully shaken up, and he was finding what limits the mind has to endurance. He drank more brandy and soda than he had any evening in months. He was altogether a fine example of great mental perturbation. For all his study, nothing came of the evening except this: he sent the money. It was with great opposition, after 2 or 3 hours of the most urgent mental affirmation and denial, that at last he got an envelope, placed in it the requested amount, and slowly sealed it up. Then he called Harry, the boy of all work around the place. "You take this to this address," he said, handing him the envelope, "and give it to Mrs. Hurstwood." "Yes, sir," said the boy. "If she isn't there, bring it back." "Yes, sir." "You've seen my wife?" he asked, as a precautionary measure, as the boy turned to go. "Oh, yes, sir. I know her." "All right now. Hurry right back." "Any answer?" "I guess not." The boy hastened away, and the manager fell to his musings. Now he had done it. There was no use speculating over that. He was beaten for tonight, and he might just as well make the best of it. But oh, the wretchedness of being forced this way! He could see her meeting the boy at the door and smiling sardonically. She would take the envelope and know that she had triumphed. If he only had that letter back, he wouldn't send it. He breathed heavily and wiped the moisture from his face. For relief, he arose and joined in the conversation with a few friends who were drinking. He tried to get the interest of things about him, but it was not to be. All the time his thoughts would run out to his home and see the scene being therein enacted. All the time he was wondering what she would say when the boy handed her the envelope. In about an hour and 3/4 the boy returned. He had evidently delivered the package, for, as he came up, he made no sign of taking anything out of his pocket. "Well?" said Hurstwood. "I gave it to her." "My wife?" "Yes, sir." "Any answer?" "She said it was high time." Hurstwood scowled fiercely. There was no more to be done upon that score that night. He went on brooding over his situation until midnight, when he repaired again to the Palmer house. He wondered what the morning would bring forth, and slept anything but soundly upon it. Next day he went again to the office and opened his mail, suspicious and hopeful of its contents. No word from Carrie, nothing from his wife, which was pleasant. The fact that he had sent the money and that she had received it worked to the ease of his mind, for, as the thought that he had done it receded, his chagrin at it grew less and his hope of peace more. He fancied, as he sat at his desk, that nothing would be done for a week or two. Meanwhile, he would have time to think. This process of thinking began by a reversion to Carrie, and the arrangement by which he was to get her away from Drouet. How about that now? His pain at her failure to meet or write him rapidly increased as he devoted himself to the subject. He decided to write her care of the West Side Post Office and ask for an explanation, as well as to have her meet him. The thought that this letter would probably not reach her until Monday chafed him exceedingly. He must get some speedier method, but how? He thought upon it for a half-hour, not contemplating a messenger or a cab direct to the house, owing to the exposure of it. But finding that time was slipping away to no purpose, he wrote a letter and then began to think again. The hours slipped by, and with them the possibility of the union he had contemplated. He had thought to be joyously aiding Carrie by now in the task of joining her interests to his, and here it was afternoon and nothing done. 3 o'clock came, 4, 5, 6, and no letter. The helpless manager paced the floor and grimly endured the gloom of defeat. He saw a busy Saturday ushered out, the Sabbath in, and nothing done. All day, the bar being closed, he brooded alone, shut out from home, from the excitement of his resort, from Carrie, and without the ability to alter his condition one iota. It was the worst Sunday he had spent in his life. In Monday's second mail he encountered a very legal-looking letter, which held his interest for some time. It bore the imprint of the law offices of McGregor, James, and Hay, and with a very formal "Dear Sir," and "We beg to state," went on to inform him briefly that they had been retained by Mrs. Julia Hurstwood to adjust certain matters which related to her sustenance and property rights, and would he kindly call them and see about the matter at once. He read it through carefully several times, and then merely shook his head. It seemed as if his family troubles were just beginning. "Well," he said after a time, quite audibly, "I don't know." Then he folded it up and put it in his pocket. To add to his misery, there was no word from Carrie. He was quite certain now that she knew he was married, and was angered at his perfidy. His loss seemed all the more bitter now that he needed her most. He thought he would go out and insist on seeing her if she did not send him word of some sort soon. He was really affected most miserably of all by this desertion. He had loved her earnestly enough, but now that the possibility of losing her stared him in the face, she seemed much more attractive. He really pined for a word, and looked out upon her with his mind's eye in the most wistful manner. He did not propose to lose her, whatever she might think. Come what might, he would adjust to this matter, and soon. He would go to her and tell her all his family complications. He would explain to her just where he stood and how much he needed her. Surely she couldn't go back on him now. It wasn't possible. He would plead until her anger would melt, until she would forgive him. Suddenly he thought, supposing she isn't out there? Suppose she has gone? He was forced to take his feet. It was too much to think of and sit still. Nevertheless, his rousing availed him nothing. On Tuesday it was the same way. He did manage to bring himself into the mood to go out to Carrie, but when he got in Ogden Place he thought he saw a man watching him and went away. He did not go within a block of the house. One of the galling incidents of this visit was that he came back on a Randolph Street car, and without noticing, arrived almost opposite the building of the concern with which his son was connected. This sent a pang through his heart. He had called on his boy there several times. Now the lad had not sent him a word. His absence did not seem to be noticed by either of his children. Well, well, fortune pays a man queer tricks. He got back to his office and joined in a conversation with friends. It was as if idle chatter deadened the sense of misery. That night he dined at Rector's and returned at once to his office. In the bustle and show of the latter was his only relief. He troubled over many little details, and talked perfunctorily to everybody. He stayed at his desk long after all others had gone, and only quitted it when the night watchman on his round pulled at the front door to see if it was safely locked. On Wednesday he received another polite note from McGregor, James, and Hay. It read, "Dear Sir, we beg to inform you that we are instructed to wait until tomorrow, Thursday, at 1 o'clock, before filing suit against you on behalf of Mrs. Julia Hurstwood for divorce and alimony. If we do not hear from you before that time, we shall consider that you do not wish to compromise the matter in any way, and act accordingly. Very truly yours, etc." "Compromise!" exclaimed Hurstwood bitterly. "Compromise!" Again he shook his head. So here it was spread out clear before him, and now he knew what to expect. If he didn't go and see them, they would sue him promptly. If he did, he would be offered terms that would make his blood boil. He folded the letter and put it with the other one. Then he put on his hat and went for a turn around the block. End of chapter 25. Recording by Carrie Bradfield, St. Louis, Missouri.
Chapter 26 of Sister Carrie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carrie Bradfield. Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. Chapter 26. The Ambassador Fallen, A Search for the Gate. Carrie, left alone by Drouet, listened to his retreating steps, scarcely realizing what had happened. She knew that he had stormed out. It was some moments before she questioned whether he would return. Not now exactly, but ever. She looked around her upon the rooms, out of which the evening light was dying, and wondered why she did not feel quite the same towards them. She went over to the dresser and struck a match, lighting the gas. Then she went back to the rocker to think. It was some time before she could collect her thoughts, but when she did, this truth began to take on importance. She was quite alone. Suppose Drouet did not come back? Suppose she should never hear anything more of him? This fine arrangement of chambers would not last long. She would have to quit them. To her credit, be it said, she never once counted on Hurstwood. She could only approach that subject with a pang of sorrow and regret. For a truth, she was rather shocked and frightened by this evidence of human depravity. He would have tricked her without turning an eyelash. She would have been led into a newer and worse situation, and yet she could not keep out the pictures of his looks and manners. Only this one deed seemed strange and miserable. It contrasted sharply with all she felt and knew concerning the man. But she was alone. That was a greater thought just at present. How about that? Would she go out to work again? Would she begin to look around in the business district? The stage? Oh yes, Drouet had spoken about that. Was there any hope there? She moved to and fro in deep and varied thoughts, while the minutes slipped away and the night fell completely. She had had nothing to eat, and yet there she sat, thinking it over. She remembered that she was hungry and went to the little cupboard in the rear room where were the remains of one of their breakfasts. She looked at these things with certain misgivings. The contemplation of food had more significance than usual. While she was eating, she began to wonder how much money she had. It struck her as exceedingly important, and without ado she went to look for her purse. It was on the dresser, and in it were $7 in bills and some change. She quailed as she thought of the insignificance of the amount, and rejoiced because the rent was paid until the end of the month. She began also to think of what she would have done if she had gone out into the street when she first started. By the sight of that situation, as she looked at it now, the present seemed agreeable. She had a little time at least, and then, perhaps, everything would come out all right after all. Drouet had gone, but what of it? He did not seem seriously angry. He only acted as if he were in a hurry. He would come back. Of course he would. There was his cane in the corner. Here was one of his collars. He had left his light overcoat in the wardrobe. She looked about and tried to assure herself with the sight of a dozen such details, but alas, the secondary thought arrived. Supposing he did come back, then what? Here was another proposition nearly, if not quite as, disturbing. She would have to talk with and explain to him. He would want her to admit that he was right. It would be impossible for her to live with him. On Friday, Carrie remembered her appointment with Hurstwood, and the passing of the hour when she should, by all right of promise, have been in his company, served to keep the calamity which had befallen her exceedingly fresh and clear. In her nervousness and stress of mind, she felt it necessary to act, and consequently put on a brown street dress, and at 11 o'clock started to visit the business portion once again. She must look for work. The rain, which threatened at 12 and began at 1, served equally well to cause her to retrace her steps and remain within doors, as it did to reduce Hurstwood's spirits and give him a wretched day. The morrow was Saturday, a half-holiday in many business quarters, and besides, it was a balmy, radiant day, with the trees and grass shining exceedingly green after the rain of the night before. When she went out, the sparrows were twittering merrily in joyous choruses. She could not help feeling, as she looked across the lovely park, that life was a joyous thing for those who did not need to worry, and she wished over and over that something might interfere now to preserve for her the comfortable state which she had occupied. She did not want Drouet or his money when she thought of it, nor anything more to do with Hurstwood, but only the content and ease of mind she had experienced, for, after all, she had been happy. Happier at least than she was now when confronted by the necessity of making her way alone. When she arrived in the business part, it was quite 11 o'clock, and the business had little longer to run. She did not realize this at first, being affected by some of the old distress, which was a result of her earlier adventure into this strenuous and exacting quarter. She wandered about, assuring herself that she was making up her mind to look for something, and at the same time feeling that perhaps it was not necessary to be in such a haste about it. The thing was difficult to encounter, and she had a few days. Besides, she was not sure that she was really face to face again with the bitter problem of self-sustenance. Anyhow, there was one change for the better. She knew that she had improved in appearance. Her manner had vastly changed. Her clothes were becoming, and men, well-dressed men, some of the kind who before had gazed at her indifferently from behind their polished railings and imposing office partitions, now gazed into her face with a soft light in their eyes. In a way, she felt the power and satisfaction of the thing, but it did not wholly reassure her. She looked for nothing save what might come legitimately and without the appearance of special favor. She wanted something, but no man should buy her by false protestations or favor. She proposed to earn her living honestly. "This store closes at 1 on Saturdays," was a pleasing and satisfactory legend to see upon doors which she felt she ought to enter and inquire for work. It gave her an excuse, and after encountering quite a number of them and noting that the clock registered 12:15, she decided that it would be no use to seek further today. So she got on a car and went to Lincoln Park. There was always something to see there, the flowers, the animals, the lake, and she flattered herself that on Monday she would be up betimes and searching. Besides, many things might happen between now and Monday. Sunday passed with equal doubts, worries, assurances, and heaven knows what vagaries of mind and spirit. Every half hour in the day the thought would come to her most sharply, like the tail of a swishing whip, that action, immediate action, was imperative. At other times she would look about her and assure herself that things were not so bad, that certainly she would come out safe and sound. At such times she would think of Drouet's advice about going on the stage, and saw some chance for herself in that quarter. She decided to take up that opportunity on the morrow. Accordingly, she arose early Monday morning, and dressed herself carefully. She did not know just how such applications were made, but she took it to be a matter which related more directly to the theater buildings. All you had to do was inquire of someone about the theater for the manager and ask for a position. If there was anything, you might get it, or at least he could tell you how. She had had no experience with this class of individuals whatsoever, and did not know the salacity and humor of the theatrical tribe. She only knew of the position which Mr. Hale occupied, but, of all things, she did not wish to encounter that personage on account of her intimacy with his wife. There was, however, at this time one theater, the Chicago Opera House, which was considerably in the public eye, and its manager, David A. Henderson, had a fair local reputation. Carrie had seen one or two elaborate performances there, and had heard of several others. She knew nothing of Henderson, nor of the methods of applying, but she instinctively felt that this would be a likely place, and accordingly strolled about in that neighborhood. She came bravely enough to the showy entranceway, with the polished and begilded lobby set with framed pictures out of the current attraction, leading up to the quiet box office, but she could get no further. A noted comic opera comedian was holding forth that week, and the air of distinction and prosperity overawed her. She could not imagine that there would be anything in such a lofty sphere for her. She almost trembled at the audacity which might have carried her on to a terrible rebuff. She could find heart only to look at the pictures which were showy, and then walk out. It seemed to her as if she had made a splendid escape, and that it would be foolhardy to think of applying in that quarter again. This little experience settled her hunting for one day. She looked around elsewhere, but it was from the outside. She got the location of several playhouses fixed in her mind, notably the Grand Opera House and McVicker's, both of which were leading in attractions, and then came away. Her spirits were materially reduced, owing to the newly restored sense of magnitude of the great interests and the insignificance of her claims upon society, such as she understood them to be. That night she was visited by Mrs. Hale, whose chatter and protracted stay made it impossible to dwell upon her predicament or the fortune of the day. Before retiring, however, she sat down to think, and gave herself up to the most gloomy forebodings. Drouet had not put in an appearance. She had had no word from any quarter. She had spent $1 of her precious sum in procuring food and paying car fare. It was evident that she would not endure long. Besides, she had discovered no resource. In this situation her thoughts went out to her sister in Van Buren Street, whom she had not seen since the night of her flight, and to her home at Columbia City, which seemed now a part of something that could not be again. She looked for no refuge in that direction. Nothing but sorrow was brought to her by thoughts of Hurstwood, which would return. That he could have chosen to dupe her in so ready a manner seemed a cruel thing. Tuesday came, and with it appropriate indecision and speculation. She was in no mood, after her failure of the day before, to hasten forth upon her work-seeking errand, and yet she rebuked herself for what she considered her weakness the day before. Accordingly, she started out to revisit the Chicago Opera House, but possessed scarcely enough courage to approach. She did manage to inquire at the box office, however. "Manager of the company or the house?" asked the smartly dressed individual who took care of the tickets. He was favorably impressed by Carrie's looks. "I don't know," said Carrie, taken aback by the question. "You couldn't see the manager of the house today, anyhow," volunteered the young man. "He's out of town." He noted her puzzled look, and then added, "What is it you wish to see about?" "I want to see about getting a position," she answered. "You'd better see the manager of the company," he returned, "but he isn't here now." "When will he be in?" asked Carrie, somewhat relieved by this information. "Well, you might find him in between 11 and 12. He's here after 2 o'clock. Carrie thanked him and walked briskly out, while the young man gazed after her through one of the side windows of his gilded coupe. "Good-looking," he said to himself, and proceeded to visions of condescensions on her part which were exceedingly flattering to himself. One of the principal comedy companies of the day was playing an engagement at the Grand Opera House. Here Carrie asked to see the manager of the company. She little knew the trivial authority of this individual, or that had there been a vacancy, an actor would have been sent on from New York to fill it. "His office is upstairs," said a man in the box office. Several persons were in the manager's office, two lounging near a window, another talking to an individual sitting at a roll-top desk, the manager. Carrie glanced nervously about, and began to fear that she should have to make her appeal before the assembled company, two of whom, the occupants of the window, were already observing her carefully. "I can't do it," the manager was saying. "It's a rule of Mr. Frohman's never to allow visitors back of the stage. No, no." Carrie timidly waited, standing. There were chairs, but no one motioned her to be seated. The individual to whom the manager had been talking went away quite crestfallen. That luminary gazed earnestly at some papers before him, as if they were of the greatest concern. "Did you see that in the Herald this morning about Nat Goodwin, Harris?" "No," said the person addressed. "What was it?" "Made quite a curtain address at Hooley's last night. Better look it up." Harris reached over to a table and began to look for the Herald. "What is it?" said the manager to Carrie, apparently noticing her for the first time. He thought he was going to be held up for free tickets. Carrie summoned up all her courage, which was little at best. She realized that she was a novice, and felt as if a rebuff were certain. Of this she was so sure that she only wished now to pretend she had called for advice. "Can you tell me how to go about getting on the stage?" It was the best way, after all, to have gone about the matter. She was interesting, in a manner, to the occupant of the chair, and the simplicity of her request and attitude took his fancy. He smiled, as did the others in the room, who, however, made some slight effort to conceal their humor. "I don't know," he answered, looking her brazenly over. "Have you ever had any experience upon the stage?" "A little," answered Carrie. "I have taken part in amateur performances." She thought she had to make some sort of showing in order to retain his interest. "Never studied for the stage?" he said, putting on an air intended as much to impress his friends with his discretion as Carrie. "No, sir." "Well, I don't know," he answered, tipping lazily back in his chair while she stood before him. "What makes you want to get on the stage?" She felt abashed at the man's daring, but could only smile in answer to his engaging smirk and say, "I need to make a living." "Oh," he answered, rather taken by her trim appearance, and feeling as if he might scrape up an acquaintance with her. "That's a good reason, isn't it? Well, Chicago is not a good place for what you want to do. You ought to be in New York. There's more chance there. You could hardly expect to get started out here." Carrie smiled genially, grateful that he should condescend to advise her even so much. He noticed the smile and put a slightly different construction on it. He thought he saw an easy chance for a little flirtation. "Sit down," he said, pulling a chair forward from the side of his desk and dropping his voice so that the two men in the room should not hear. Those two gave each other the suggestion of a wink. "Well, I'll be going, Barney," said one, breaking away and so addressing the manager. "See you this afternoon." "All right," said the manager. The remaining individual took up a paper as if to read. "Did you have any idea what sort of part you would like to get?" asked the manager softly. "Oh, no," said Carrie. "I would take anything to begin with." "I see," he said. "Do you live here in the city?" "Yes, sir." The manager smiled most blandly. "Have you ever tried to get in as a chorus girl?" he asked, assuming a more confidential air. Carrie began to feel that there was something exuberant and unnatural in his manner. "No," she said. "That's the way most girls begin," he went on, "who go on the stage. It's a good way to get experience." He was turning on her a glance of the companionable and persuasive manner. "I didn't know that," said Carrie. "It's a difficult thing," he went on, "but there's always a chance, you know." Then, as if he suddenly remembered, he pulled out his watch and consulted it. "I've an appointment at 2:00, he said, "and I've got to go to lunch now. Would you care to come and dine with me? We can talk it over there." "Oh, no," said Carrie, the whole motive of the man flashing on her at once. "I have an engagement myself." "That's too bad," he said, realizing that he had been a little beforehand in his offer, and that Carrie was about to go away. "Come in later. I may know of something." "Thank you," she answered, with some trepidation, and went out. "She was good-looking, wasn't she?" said the manager's companion, who had not caught all the details of the game he had played. Yes, in a way, said the other, sore to think the game had been lost. She'd never make an actress, though. Just another chorus girl, that's all. This little experience nearly destroyed her ambition to call upon the manager at the Chicago Opera House, but she decided to do so after a time. He was a more sedate turn of mind. He said at once that there was no opening of any sort, and seemed to consider her search foolish. Chicago is no place to get a start, he said. You ought to be in New York. Still, she persisted, and went to McVicker's, where she could not find anyone. The old homestead was running there, but the person to whom she was referred was not to be found. These little expeditions took up her time until quite 4 o'clock, when she was weary enough to go home. She felt as if she ought to continue and inquire elsewhere, but the results so far were too dispiriting. She took the car and arrived at Ogden Place in 3/4 of an hour, but decided to ride on to the West Side branch of the post office, where she was accustomed to receive Hurstwood's letters. There was one there now, written Saturday, which she tore open and read with mingled feelings. There was so much warmth in it, and such tense complaint at her having failed to meet him, and her subsequent silence, that she rather pitied the man. That he loved her was evident enough. That he wished and dared to do so, married as he was the evil. She felt as if the thing deserved an answer, and consequently decided that she would write and let him know that she knew of his married state and was justly incensed at his deception. She would tell him that it was all over between them. At her room, the wording of this missive occupied her for some time, for she fell to the task at once. It was most difficult. You do not need to have me explain why I did not meet you, she wrote in part. How could you deceive me so? You cannot expect me to have anything more to do with you. I wouldn't under any circumstances. Oh, how could you act so? She added in a burst of feeling. You have caused me more misery than you can think. I hope you will get over your infatuation for me. We must not meet any more. Good-bye. She took the letter the next morning, and at the corner dropped it reluctantly into the letter-box, still uncertain as to whether she should do so or not. Then she took the car and went downtown. This was the dull season with the department stores, but she was listened to with more consideration than was usually accorded to young women applicants, owing to her neat and attractive appearance. She was asked the same old questions with which she was already familiar. What can you do? Have you ever worked in a retail store before? Are you experienced? At the fair, C and Company's, and all the great stores it was much the same. It was the dull season. She might come in a little later. Possibly they would like to have her. When she arrived at the house at the end of the day, weary and disheartened, she discovered that Drouet had been there. His umbrella and light overcoat were gone. She thought she missed other things, but could not be sure. Everything had not been taken. So his going was crystallizing into staying. What was she to do now? Evidently she would be facing the world in the same old way within a day or two. Her clothes would get poor. She put her two hands together in her customary expressive way and pressed her fingers. Large tears gathered in her eyes and broke hot across her cheeks. She was alone, very much alone. Drouet really had called, but it was with a very different mind from that which Carrie had imagined. He expected to find her, to justify his return by claiming that he came to get the remaining portion of his wardrobe, and before he got away again to patch up a piece. Accordingly, when he arrived, he was disappointed to find Carrie out. He trifled about, hoping that she was somewhere in the neighborhood and would soon return. He constantly listened, expecting to hear her foot on the stair. When he did so, it was his intention to make believe that he had just come in and was disturbed at being caught. Then he would explain his need of clothes and find out how things stood. Wait as he did, however, Carrie did not come. From pottering around among the drawers, in momentary expectation of her arrival, he changed to looking out of the window, and from that to resting himself in the rocking-chair. Still no Carrie. He began to grow restless and lit a cigar. After that he walked the floor. Then he looked out of the window and saw clouds gathering. He remembered an appointment at 3. He began to think that it would be useless to wait, and got hold of his umbrella and light coat, intending to take these things anyway. It would scare her, he hoped. Tomorrow he would come back for the others. He would find out how things stood. As he started to go, he felt truly sorry that he had missed her. There was a little picture of her on the wall, showing her arrayed in the little jacket he had first bought her, her face a little more wistful than he had seen it lately. He was really touched by it, and looked into the eyes of it with a rather rare feeling for him. "You didn't do me right, Cad," he said, as if he were addressing her in the flesh. Then he went to the door, took a good look around, and went out. End of chapter 26. Recording by Carrie Bradfield, St. Louis, Missouri. Chapter 27 of Sister Carrie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carrie Bradfield. Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. Chapter 27. When waters engulf us, we reach for a star. It was when he returned from his disturbed stroll around the streets, after receiving the decisive note from McGregor, James, and Hay, that Hurstwood found the letter Carrie had written him that morning. He thrilled intensely as he noted the handwriting, and rapidly tore it open. Then, he thought, she loves me, or she would not have written to me at all. He was slightly depressed at the tenor of the note for the first few minutes, but soon recovered. She wouldn't write at all if she didn't care for me. This was his one resource against the depression which held him. He could extract little from the wording of the letter, but the spirit he thought he knew. There was really something exceedingly human, if not pathetic, in his being thus relieved by a clearly worded reproof. He, who had for so long remained satisfied for himself, now looked outside of himself for comfort, and to such a source. The mystic cords of affection, how they bind us all. The color came to his cheeks. For the moment he forgot the letter from McGregor, James, and Hay. If he could only have Carrie, perhaps he could get out of this whole entanglement. Perhaps it would not matter. He wouldn't care what his wife did with herself, if only he might not lose Carrie. He stood up and walked about, dreaming his delightful dream of a life continued with this lovely possessor of his heart. It was not long, however, before the old worry was back for consideration, and with it what weariness. He thought of the morrow and the suit. He had done nothing, and here was the afternoon slipping away. It was now 4:15. At 5 the attorneys would have gone home. He still had the morrow until noon. Even as he thought, the last 15 minutes passed away, and it was 5. Then he abandoned the thought of seeing them any more that day, and turned to Carrie. It is to be observed that the man did not justify himself to himself. He was not troubling about that. His whole thought was the possibility of persuading Carrie. Nothing was wrong in that. He loved her dearly. Their mutual happiness depended upon it. Would that Drouet were only away! While he was thinking thus elatedly, he remembered that he wanted some clean linen in the morning. This he purchased, together with a half-dozen ties, and went to the Palmer house. As he entered, he thought he saw Drouet ascending the stairs with a key. Surely not Drouet! Then he thought perhaps they had changed their abode temporarily. He went straight up to the desk. "Is Mr. Drouet stopping here?" he asked of the clerk. "I think he is," said the latter, consulting his private registry list. "Yes." "Is that so?" exclaimed Hurstwood, otherwise concealing his astonishment. "Alone?" he added. "Yes," said the clerk. Hurstwood turned away and set his lips so as to best express and conceal his feelings. "How's that?" he thought. "They've had a row." He hastened to his room with rising spirits and changed his linen. As he did so, he made up his mind that if Carrie was alone, or if she had gone to another place, it behooved him to find out. He decided to call at once. "I know what I'll do," he thought. "I'll go to the door and ask if Mr. Drouet is at home. That will bring out whether he is there or not, and where Carrie is." He was almost moved to some muscular display as he thought of it. He decided to go immediately after supper. On coming down from his room at 6, he looked carefully about to see if Drouet was present, and then went out to lunch. He could scarcely eat, however, he was so anxious to be about his errand. Before starting, he thought it was well to discover where Drouet would be, and return to his hotel. "Has Mr. Drouet gone out?" he asked of the clerk. "No," answered the latter. "He's in his room. Do you wish to send up a card?" "No, I'll call around later," answered Hurstwood, and strolled out. He took a Madison car and went direct to Ogden Place, this time walking boldly up to the door. The chambermaid answered his knock. "Is Mr. Drouet in?" said Hurstwood blandly. "He is out of the city," said the girl, who had heard Carrie tell this to Mrs. Hale. "Is Mrs. Drouet in?" "No, she has gone to the theater." "Is that so?" said Hurstwood, considerably taken back. Then, as if burdened with something important, "You don't know to which theater?" The girl really had no idea where she had gone, but not liking Hurstwood and wishing to cause him trouble, answered, "Yes, Hooley's." "Thank you," returned the manager, and tipping his hat slightly, went away. "I'll look in at Hooley's," thought he, but as a matter of fact he did not. Before he had reached the central portion of the city, he thought the whole matter over, and decided it would be useless. As much as he longed to see Carrie, he knew she would be with someone and did not wish to intrude with his plea there. A little later he might do so, in the morning. Only, in the morning he had the lawyer question before him. This little pilgrimage threw quite a wet blanket upon his rising spirits. He was soon down again to his old worry, and reached the resort anxious to find relief. Quite a company of gentlemen were making the place lively with their conversation. A group of Cook County politicians were conferring about a round cherry-wood table in the rear portion of the room. Several young merrymakers were chattering at the bar before making a belated visit to the theater. A shabbily genteel individual with a red nose and an old high hat was sipping a quiet glass of ale alone at one end of the bar. Hurstwood nodded to the politicians and went into his office. About 10 o'clock a friend of his, Mr. Frank L. Tainter, a local sport and racing man, dropped in, and seeing Hurstwood alone in his office, came to the door. "Hello, George," he exclaimed. "How are you, Frank?" said Hurstwood, somewhat relieved by the sight of him. "Sit down." And he motioned to one of the chairs in the little room. "What's the matter, George?" asked Tainter. "You look a little glum. Haven't lost at the track, have you?" "I'm not feeling very well tonight. I had a slight cold the other day." "Take whiskey, George," said Tainter. "You ought to know that." Hurstwood smiled. While they were still conferring there, several other of Hurstwood's friends entered, and not long after 11, the theaters being out, some actors began to drop in, among them some notabilities. Then began one of those pointless social conversations so common in America resorts, where the would-be gilded attempt to rub guilt from those who have it in abundance. If Hurstwood had one leaning, it was toward notabilities. He considered that, if anywhere, he belonged among them. He was too proud to toady, too keen not to strictly observe the plane he occupied when there were those present who did not appreciate him, but, in situations like the present, where he could shine as a gentleman and be received without equivocation as a friend and equal among men of known ability, he was most delighted. It was on such occasions, if ever, that he would take something. When the social flavor was strong enough, he would even unbend to the extent of drinking glass for glass with his associates, punctiliously observing his turn to pay, as if he were an outsider like the others. If he ever approached intoxication, or rather that ruddy warmth and comfortableness which precedes the more sloven state, it was when individuals such as these were gathered about him, when he was one of a circle of chatting celebrities. Tonight, disturbed as was his state, he was rather relieved to find company, and now that notabilities were gathered, he laid aside his troubles for the nonce and joined in right heartily. It was not long before the imbibing began to tell. Stories began to crop up, those ever-enduring, droll stories which form the major portion of the conversation among American men under such circumstances. 12 o'clock arrived, the hour for closing, and with it the company took leave. Hurstwood shook hands with them most cordially. He was very roseate physically. He had arrived at that state where his mind, though clear, was nevertheless warm in its fancies. He felt as if his troubles were not very serious. Going into his office, he began to turn over certain accounts, awaiting the departure of the bartenders and the cashier, who soon left. It was the manager's duty, as well as his custom, after all were gone, to see that everything was safely closed up for the night. As a rule, no money except the cash taken in after banking hours was kept about the place, and that was locked in a safe by the cashier, who, with the owners, was joint keeper of the secret combination. But, nevertheless, Hurstwood nightly took the precaution to try the cash drawers and the safe in order to see that they were tightly closed. Then he would lock his own little office and set the proper light burning near the safe, after which he would take his departure. Never in his experience had he found anything out of order, but tonight, after shutting down his desk, he came out and tried the safe. His way was to give a sharp pull. This time the door responded. He was slightly surprised at that, and looking in, found the money cases as left for the day, apparently unprotected. His first thought was, of course, to inspect the drawers and shut the door. "I'll speak to Mayhew about this tomorrow," he thought. The latter had certainly imagined upon going out a half-hour before that he had turned the knob on the door so as to spring the lock. He had never failed to do so before, but tonight Mayhew had other thoughts. He had been revolving the problem of a business of his own. "I'll look in here," thought the manager, pulling out the money drawers. He did not know why he wished to look in there. It was quite a superfluous action, which another time might not have happened at all. As he did so, a layer of bills, in parcels of 1,000, such as bank issues, caught his eye. He could not tell how much they represented, but paused to view them. Then he pulled out the second of the cash drawers. In that were the receipts of the day. "I didn't know Fitzgerald and Moy ever left any money this way," his mind said to itself. "They must have forgotten it." He looked at the other drawer and paused again. "Count them," said a voice in his ear. He put his hand into the first of the boxes and lifted the stack, letting the separate parcels fall. They were bills of $50 and $100, done in packages of 1,000. He thought he counted 10 such. "Why don't I shut the safe?" his mind said to itself, lingering. "What makes me pause here?" For answer there came the strangest words. "Did you ever have $10,000 in ready money?" Lo, the manager remembered that he had never had so much. All his property had been slowly accumulated, and now his wife owned that. He was worth more than 40,000 all told, but she would get that. He puzzled as he thought of these things, then pushed in the drawers and closed the door, pausing with his hand upon the knob, which might so easily lock it beyond temptation. Still he paused. Finally he went to the windows and pulled down the curtains. Then he tried the door, which he had previously locked. What was this thing making him suspicious? Why did he wish to move about so quietly? He came back to the end of the counter as if to rest his arm and think. Then he went and unlocked his little office door and turned on the light. He also opened his desk, sitting down before it, only to think strange thoughts. "The safe is open," said a voice. "There is just the least little crack in it. The lock has not been sprung." The manager floundered among a jumble of thoughts. Now all the entanglement of the day came back. Also the thought that here was a solution. That money would do it. If he had that and Carrie? He rose up and stood stock still, looking at the floor. "What about it?" his mind asked, and for answer he put his hand slowly up and scratched his head. The manager was no fool to be led blindly away by such an errant proposition as this, but his situation was peculiar. Wine was in his veins. It had crept up into his head and given him a warm view of the situation. It also colored the possibilities of 10,000 for him. He could see great opportunities with that. He could get Carrie. Oh, yes, he could. He could get rid of his wife. That letter, too, was waiting discussion tomorrow morning. He would not need to answer that. He went back to the safe and put his hand on the knob. Then he pulled the door open and took the drawer with the money quite out. With it once out and before him, it seemed a foolish thing to think about leaving it. Certainly it would. Why, he could live quietly with Carrie for years. Lord, what was that? For the first time he was tense, as if a stern hand had been laid upon his shoulder. He looked fearfully around. Not a soul was present, not a sound. Someone was shuffling by on the sidewalk. He took the box and the money and put it back in the safe. Then he partly closed the door again. To those who have never wavered in conscience, the predicament of the individual whose mind is less strongly constituted and who trembles in the balance between duty and desire is scarcely appreciable, unless graphically portrayed. Those who have never heard the solemn voice of the ghostly clock which ticks with awful distinctness, "Thou shalt not, thou shalt not," are in no position to judge. Not alone in sensitive, highly organized natures is such a mental conflict possible. The dullest specimen of humanity when drawn by desire toward evil, is recalled by a sense of right, which is proportionate in power and strength to his evil tendency. We must remember that it may not be a knowledge of right, for no knowledge of right is predicated of the animal's instinctive recoil at evil. Men are still led by instinct before they are regulated by knowledge. It is instinct which recalls the criminal. It is instinct, where highly organized reasoning is absent, which gives the criminal his feeling of danger, his fear of wrong. At every first adventure, then, into some untried evil, the mind wavers. The clock of thought ticks out its wish and denial. To those who have never experienced such a mental dilemma, the following will appeal on the simple ground of revelation. When Hurstwood put the money back, his nature again resumed its ease and daring. No one had observed him. He was quite alone. No one could tell what he wished to do. He could work this thing out for himself. The imbibation of the evening had not yet worn off. Moist as was his brow, tremble as did his hand once after the nameless fright, he was still flushed with the fumes of liquor. He scarcely noticed that the time was passing. He went over his situation once again, his eye always seeing the money in a lump, his mind always seeing what it would do. He strolled into his little room, then to the door, then to the safe again. He put his hand on the knob and opened it. There was the money. Surely no harm could come from looking at it. He took out the drawer again and lifted the bills. They were so smooth, so compact, so portable. How little they made after all. He decided he would take them. Yes, he would. He would put them in his pocket. Then he looked at that and saw they would not go there. His hand satchel, to be sure, his hand satchel. They would go in that. All of it would. No one would think anything of it either. He went into the little office and took it from the shelf in the corner. Now he sat it upon his desk and went out toward the safe. For some reason he did not want to fill it out in the big room. First he brought the bills and the loose receipts of the day. He would take it all. He put the empty drawers back and pushed the iron door almost to, then stood beside it meditating. The wavering of a mind under such circumstances is an almost inexplicable thing, and yet it is absolutely true. Hurstwood could not bring himself to act definitely. He wanted to think about it, to ponder over it, to decide whether it were best. He was drawn by such a keen desire for Carrie, driven by such a state of turmoil in his own affairs, that he thought constantly it would be best, and yet he wavered. He did not know what evil might result from it to him, how soon he might come to grief. The true ethics of the situation never once occurred to him, and never would have under any circumstances. After he had all the money in the handbag, a revulsion of feeling seized him. He would not do it. No! Think of what a scandal it would make. The police, they would be after him. He would have to fly. And where? Oh, the terror of being a fugitive from justice! He took out the 2 boxes and put all the money back. In his excitement he forgot what he was doing and put the sums in the wrong boxes. As he pushed the door to, he thought he remembered doing it wrong and opened the door again. There were the 2 boxes mixed. He took them out and straightened the matter, but now the terror had gone. Why be afraid? While the money was in his hand, the lock clicked. It had sprung. Did he do it? He grabbed at the knob and pulled vigorously. It had closed. Heavens, he was in for it now, sure enough. The moment he realized that the safe was locked for a surety, the sweat burst out upon his brow and he trembled violently. He looked around him and decided instantly. There was no delaying now. "Supposing I do lay it on the top," he said, "and go away. They'll know who took it. I'm the last to close up. Besides, other things will happen." At once he became the man of action. "I must get out of this," he thought. He hurried into his little room, took down his light overcoat and hat, locked his desk, and grabbed at the satchel. Then he turned out all but one light and opened the door. He tried to put on his old assured air, but it was almost gone. He was repenting rapidly. "I wish I hadn't done that," he said. "That was a mistake." He walked steadily down the street, greeting a night watchman whom he knew was trying doors. He must get out of the city, and that quickly. "I wonder how the trains run," he thought. Instantly he pulled out his watch and looked. It was nearly 1:30. At the first drugstore he stopped, seeing a long-distance telephone booth inside. It was a famous drugstore and contained one of the first private telephone booths ever erected. "I want to use your phone a minute," he said to the night clerk. The latter nodded. "Give me 1643, he called to Central, after looking up the Michigan Central Depot number. Soon he got the ticket agent. "How do the trains leave here for Detroit?" he asked. The man explained the hours. "No more tonight?" "Nothing with a sleeper. Yes, there is, too," he added. "There is a mail train out of here at 3 o'clock. "All right," said Hurstwood. "What time does that get to Detroit?" He was thinking if he could only get there and cross the river into Canada, he could take his time about getting to Montreal. He was relieved to learn that it would reach there by noon. "Mayhew won't open the safe till 9, he thought. "They can't get on my track before noon." Then he thought of Carrie. With what speed he must get her, if he got her at all. She would have to come along. He jumped into the nearest cab standing by. "To Ogden Place," he said sharply. "I'll give you $1 more if you make good time." The cabby beat his horse into a sort of imitation gallop, which was fairly fast, however. On the way, Hurstwood thought what to do. Reaching the number, he hurried up the steps and did not spare the bell in waking the servant. "Is Mrs. Drouet in?" he asked. "Yes," said the astonished girl. "Tell her to dress and come to the door at once. Her husband is in the hospital injured and wants to see her." The servant girl hurried upstairs, convinced by the man's strained and emphatic manner. "What?" said Carrie, lighting the gas and searching for her clothes. "Mr. Drouet is hurt and in the hospital. He wants to see you. The cab's downstairs." Carrie dressed very rapidly and soon appeared below, forgetting everything save the necessities. "Drouet is hurt," said Hurstwood quickly. "He wants to see you. Come quickly." Carrie was so bewildered that she swallowed the whole story. "Get in," said Hurstwood, helping her and jumping after. The cabby began to turn the horse around. "Michigan Central Depot," he said, standing up and speaking so low that Carrie could not hear. "As fast as you can go." End of chapter 27. Recording by Carrie Bradfield, St. Louis, Missouri.
Chapter 28 of Sister Carrie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bob Sage. Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. Chapter 28. A Pilgrim, an Outlaw, the Spirit Detained. The cab had not traveled a short block before Carrie, settling herself and thoroughly waking in the night atmosphere, asked, "What's the matter with him? Is he hurt badly?" "It isn't anything very serious," Hurstwood said solemnly. He was very much disturbed over his own situation, and now that he had Carrie with him, he only wanted to get safely out of the reach of the law. Therefore he was in no mood for anything save such words as would further his plans distinctly. Carrie did not forget that there was something to be settled between her and Hurstwood, but the thought was ignored in her agitation. For one thing, she was to finish this strange pilgrimage. "Where is he?" "Way out on the south side," said Hurstwood. "We'll have him take the train. It's the quickest way." Carrie said nothing, and the horse gambled on. The weirdness of the city by night held her attention. She looked at the long receding rows of lamps and studied the dark, silent houses. "How did he hurt himself?" she asked, meaning what was the nature of his injuries. Hurstwood understood. He hated to lie any more than necessary, and yet he wanted no protests until he was out of danger. "I don't know exactly," he said. "They just called me up to go and get you and bring you out. They said there wasn't any need for alarm, but that I shouldn't fail to bring you." The man's serious manner convinced Carrie, and she became silent, wondering. Hurstwood examined his watch and urged the man to hurry. For one in so delicate a position, he was exceedingly cool. He could only think of how needful it was to make the train and get quietly away. Carrie seemed quite tractable, and he congratulated himself. In due time they reached the depot, and after helping her out he handed the man a $5 bill and hurried on. "You wait here," he said to Carrie when they reached the waiting room.
while I get the tickets." "Have I much time to catch the train for Detroit?" he asked the agent. "4 minutes," said the latter. He paid for 2 tickets as circumspectly as possible. "Is it far?" said Carrie, as he hurried back. "Not very," he said. "We must get right in." He pushed her before him at the gate, stood between her and the ticket man while the latter punched their tickets so that she could not see, and then hurried after. There was a long line of express and passenger cars and 1 or 2 common day coaches. As the train had only recently been made up and few passengers were expected, there were only 1 or 2 brakemen waiting. They entered the rear day coach and sat down. Almost immediately, "All aboard!" resounded faintly from the outside, and the train started. Carrie began to think it was a little bit curious, this going to a depot, but said nothing. The whole incident was so out of the natural that she did not attach too much weight to anything she imagined. "How have you been?" asked Hurstwood gently, for he now breathed easier. "Very well," said Carrie, who was so disturbed that she could not bring a proper attitude to bear in the matter. She was still nervous to reach Drouet and see what could be the matter. Hurstwood contemplated her and felt this. He was not disturbed that it should be so. He did not trouble because she was moved sympathetically in the matter. It was one of the qualities in her which pleased him exceedingly. He was only thinking how he should explain. Even this was not the most serious thing in his mind, however. His own deed and present flight were the great shadows which weighed upon him. "What a fool I was to do that!" he said over and over. "What a mistake!" In his sober senses he could scarcely realize that the thing had been done. He could not begin to feel that he was a fugitive from justice. He had often read of such things, and had thought they must be terrible, but now that the thing was upon him he only sat and looked into the past. The future was a thing which concerned the Canadian line. He wanted to reach that. As for the rest, he surveyed his actions for the evening and counted them parts of a great mistake. "Still," he said, "what could I have done?" Then he would decide to make the best of it, and would begin to do so by starting the whole inquiry over again. It was a fruitless, harassing round, and left him in a queer mood to deal with the proposition he had in the presence of Carrie. The train clacked through the yards along the lake front and ran rather slowly to 24th Street. Brakes and signals were visible without. The engine gave short calls with its whistle, and frequently the bell rang. Several brakemen came through, bearing lanterns. They were locking the vestibules and putting the cars in order for a long run. Presently it began to gain speed, and Carrie saw the silent streets flashing by in rapid succession. The engine also began its whistle calls of 4 parts, with which it signaled danger to important crossings. "Is it very far?" asked Carrie. "Not so very," said Hurstwood. He could hardly repress a smile at her simplicity. He wanted to explain and conciliate her, but he also wanted to be well out of Chicago. In the lapse of another half hour it became apparent to Carrie that it was quite a run to wherever he was taking her anyhow. "Is it in Chicago?" she asked nervously. They were now far beyond the city limits, and the train was scudding across the Indiana line at a great rate. "No," he said, "not where we're going." There was something in the way he said this which aroused her in an instant. Her pretty brow began to contract. "We are going to see Charlie, aren't we?" she asked. He felt that the time was up. An explanation might as well come now as later. Therefore he shook his head in the most gentle negative. "What?" said Carrie. She was nonplussed at the possibility of the errand being different from what she had thought. He only looked at her in the most kindly and mollifying way. "Well, where are you taking me, then?" she asked, her voice showing the quality of fright. "I'll tell you, Carrie, if you'll be quiet. I want you to come along with me to another city." "Oh!" said Carrie, her voice rising into a weak cry. "Let me off. I don't want to go with you." She was quite appalled at the man's audacity. This was something which had never for a moment entered her head. Her one thought now was to get off and away. If only the flying train could be stopped, the terrible trick would be amended. She arose and tried to push out into the aisle, anywhere. She knew she had to do something. Hurstwood laid a gentle hand on her. "Sit down, Carrie. Sit still. It won't do you any good to get up here. Listen to me, and I'll tell you what I'll do. Wait a moment." She was pushing at his knees, but he only pulled her back. No one saw this little altercation, for very few persons were in the car, and they were attempting to doze. "I won't," said Carrie, who was nevertheless complying against her will. "Let me go," she said. "How dare you?" And large tears began to gather in her eyes. Hurstwood was now fully aroused to the immediate difficulty, and ceased to think of his own situation. He must do something with this girl, or she would cause him trouble. He tried the art of persuasion with all his powers aroused. "Look here now, Carrie. You mustn't act this way. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. I don't want to do anything to make you feel bad." "Oh," sobbed Carrie. "Oh." "There, there," he said. "You mustn't cry. Won't you listen to me? Listen to me a minute, and I'll tell you why I came to do this thing. I couldn't help it. I assure you I couldn't. Won't you listen?" Her sobs disturbed him so that he was quite sure she did not hear a word he said. "Won't you listen?" he asked. "No, I won't," said Carrie, flashing up. "I want you to take me out of this, or I'll tell the conductor. I won't go with you. It's a shame." And again sobs of fright cut off her desire for expression. Hurstwood listened with some astonishment. He felt that she had just cause for feeling as she did, and yet he wished that he could straighten this thing out quickly. Shortly the conductor would come through for the tickets. He wanted no noise, no trouble of any kind. Before everything he must make her quiet. "You couldn't get out until the train stops again," said Hurst. "It won't be very long until we reach another station. You can get out then if you want to. I won't stop you. All I want you to do is to listen a moment. You'll let me tell you, won't you?" Carrie seemed not to listen. She only turned her head toward the window, where outside all was black. The train was speeding with steady grace across the fields and through the patches of wood. The long whistles came with sad, musical effect as the lonely woodland crossings were approached. Now the conductor entered the car and took up the 1 or 2 fares that had been added at Chicago. He approached Hurstwood, who handed out the tickets. Poised as she was to act, Carrie made no move. She did not look about. When the conductor had gone again, Hurstwood felt relieved. "You're angry at me because I deceived you," he said. "I didn't mean to, Carrie. As I live, I didn't. I couldn't help it. I couldn't stay away from you after the first time I saw you." He was ignoring the last deception as something that might go by the board. He wanted to convince her that his wife could no longer be a factor in their relationship. The money he had stolen he tried to shut out of his mind. "Don't talk to me," said Carrie. "I hate you. I want you to go away from me. I am going to go out at the very next station." She was in a tremble of excitement and opposition as she spoke. "All right," he said, "but you'll hear me out, won't you? After all you've said about loving me, you might hear me. I don't want to do you any harm. I'll give you the money to go back with when you go. I merely want to tell you, Carrie, you can't stop me from loving you, whatever you may think." He looked at her tenderly, but received no reply. "You think I've deceived you badly, but I haven't. I didn't do it willingly. I'm through with my wife. She hasn't any claims on me. I'll never see her any more. That's why I'm here tonight. That's why I came and got you." "You said Charlie was hurt," said Carrie savagely. "You deceived me. You've been deceiving me all the time, and now you want to force me to run away with you." She was so excited that she got up and tried to get by him again. He let her, and she took another seat. Then he followed. "Don't run away from me, Carrie," he said gently. "Let me explain. If you will only hear me out, You'll see where I stand. I tell you, my wife is nothing to me. She hasn't been anything for years, or I wouldn't have ever come near you. I'm going to get a divorce just as soon as I can. I'll never see her again. I'm done with all that. You're the only person I want. If I can have you, I won't ever think of another woman again." Carrie heard all this in a very ruffled state. It sounded sincere enough, however, despite all he had done. There was a tenseness in Hurstwood's voice and manner which could but have some effect. She did not want anything to do with him. He was married. He had deceived her once, and now again, and she thought him terrible. There is something in such daring and power which is fascinating to a woman, especially if she can be made to feel that it is all prompted by love for her. The progress of the train was having a great deal to do with the solution of this difficult situation. The speeding wheels and disappearing country put Chicago farther and farther behind. Carrie could feel that she was being borne a long distance off, that the engine was making an almost through run to some distant city. She felt at times as if she could cry out and make such a row that someone would come to her aid. At other times it seemed an almost useless thing. So far was she from any aid, no matter what she did. All the while Hurstwood was endeavoring to formulate his plea in such a way that it would strike home and bring her into sympathy with him. "I was simply put where I didn't know what else to do." Carrie deigned no suggestion of hearing this. "When I saw you wouldn't come unless I could marry you, I decided to put everything else behind me and get you to come away with me. I'm going off now to another city. I want to go to Montreal for a while, and then anywhere you want. We'll go and live in New York if you say." "I'll not have anything to do with you," said Carrie. "I want to get off this train. Where are we going?" "To Detroit," said Hurstwood. "Oh!" said Carrie in a burst of anguish. So distant and definite a point seemed to increase the difficulty. "Won't you come along with me?" he said, as if there was a great danger that she would not. "You won't need to do anything but travel with me. I'll not trouble you in any way. You can see Montreal and New York, and then, if you don't want to stay, you can go back. It'll be better than trying to go back tonight." The first gleam of fairness shone in this proposition for Carrie. It seemed a plausible thing to do, much as she feared his opposition if she tried to carry it out. Montreal and New York! Even now she was speeding toward those great, strange lands, and could see them if she liked. She thought, but made no sign. Hurstwood thought he saw a shade of compliance in this. He redoubled his ardor. "Think," he said, "what I've given up. I can't go back to Chicago any more. I've got to stay away and live alone now, if you don't come with me. You won't go back on me entirely, will you, Carrie?" "I don't want you to talk to me," she answered forcibly. Hurstwood kept silent for a while. Carrie felt the train to be slowing down. It was the moment to act, if she was to act at all. She stirred uneasily. "Don't think of going, Carrie," he said. "If you've ever cared for me at all, come along and let's start over. I'll do whatever you say. I'll marry you, or I'll let you go back. Give yourself time to think it over. I wouldn't have wanted you to come if I hadn't loved you. I tell you, Carrie, before God, I can't live without you. I won't." There was the tensity of fierceness in the man's plea which appealed deeply to her sympathies. It was a dissolving fire which was actuating him now. He was loving her too intensely to think of giving her up in this, his hour of distress. He clutched her hand nervously and pressed it with all the force of an appeal. The train was now all but stopped. It was running by some cars on a side track. Everything outside was dark and dreary. A few sprinkles on the window began to indicate that it was raining. Carrie hung in a quandary, balancing between decision and helplessness. Now the train stopped, and she was listening to his plea. The engine backed a few feet, and all was still. She wavered, totally unable to make a move. Minute after minute slipped by, and still she hesitated, he pleading. "Will you let me come back if I want to?" she asked, as if she now had the upper hand, and her companion was utterly subdued. "Of course," he answered. "You know I will." Carrie only listened as one who has granted a temporary amnesty. She began to feel as if the matter were in her hands entirely. The train was again in rapid motion. Hurstwood changed the subject. "Aren't you tired?" he said. "No," she answered. "Won't you let me get you a berth in the sleeper?" She shook her head, though for all her distress and his trickery she was beginning to notice what she had always felt, his thoughtfulness. "Oh, yes," he said, "you will feel so much better." She shook her head. "Let me fix my coat for you, anyway." He arose and ranged his light coat in a comfortable position to receive her head. "There," he said tenderly. "Now see if you can't rest a little." He could have kissed her for her compliance. He took his seat beside her and thought a moment. "I believe we're in for a heavy rain," he said. "So it looks," said Carrie, whose nerves were quieting under the sound of the raindrops, driven by a gusty wind, as the train swept on frantically through the shadow to a newer world. The fact that he had in a measure mollified Carrie was a source of satisfaction to Hurstwood, but it furnished only the most temporary relief. Now that her opposition was out of the way, he had all of his time to devote to the consideration of his own error. His condition was bitter in the extreme, for he did not want the miserable sum he had stolen. He did not want to be a thief. That sum or any other could never compensate for the state which he had thus foolishly doffed. It could not give him back his host of friends, his name, his house and family, nor Carrie as he had meant to have her. He was shut out from Chicago, from his easy, comfortable state. He had robbed himself of his dignity, his merry meetings, his pleasant evenings, and for what? The more he thought of it, the more unbearable it became. He began to think that he would try and restore himself to his old state. He would return the miserable thievings of the night and explain. Perhaps Moy would understand, perhaps they could forgive him and let him come back. By noontime the train rolled into Detroit, and he began to feel exceedingly nervous. The police must be on his track by now. They had probably notified all the police of the big cities, and detectives would be watching for him. He remembered instances in which defaulters had been captured. Consequently, he breathed heavily and paled somewhat. His hands felt as if they must have something to do. He simulated interest in several scenes without which he did not feel. He repeatedly beat his foot upon the floor. Carrie noticed his agitation, but said nothing. She had no idea what it meant or that it was important. He wondered now why he had not asked whether this train went on through to Montreal or some Canadian point. Perhaps he could have saved time. He jumped up and sought the conductor. "Does any part of this train go to Montreal?" he asked. "Yes, the next sleeper back does." He would have been asked more, but it did not seem wise, so he decided to inquire at the depot. The train rolled into the yards, clanging and puffing. "I think we'd better go right on through to Montreal," he said to Carrie. "I'll see what the connections are when we get off." He was exceedingly nervous, but did his best to put on a calm exterior. Carrie only looked at him with large, troubled eyes. She was drifting mentally, unable to say to herself what to do. The train stopped, and Hurstwood led the way out. He looked warily around him, pretending to look after Carrie. Seeing nothing that indicated studied observation, he made his way to the ticket office. "The next train for Montreal leaves when?" he asked. "In 20 minutes," said the man. He bought 2 tickets and Pullman berths. Then he hastened back to Carrie. "We go right out again," he said, scarcely noticing that Carrie looked tired and weary. "I wish I was out of all this," she exclaimed gloomily. "You'll feel better when we reach Montreal," he said. "I haven't an earthly thing with me," said Carrie. Not even a handkerchief. You can buy all you want as soon as we get there, dearest, he explained. You can call in a dressmaker. Now the crier called the train ready, and they got on. Hurstwood breathed a sigh of relief as it started. There was a short run to the river, and there they were ferried over. They had barely pulled the train off the ferry boat when he settled back with a sigh. "It won't be very long now," he said, remembering her in his relief. "We get there the first thing in the morning." Carrie scarcely deigned to reply. "I'll see if there's a dining car," he added. "I'm hungry." End of chapter 28. Recording by Bob Sage. Chapter 29 of Sister Carrie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bob Sage. Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. Chapter 29. The Solace of Travel. The Boats of the Sea. To the untraveled, territory other than their own familiar heath is invariably fascinating. Next to love, it is the one thing which solaces and delights. Things new are too important to be neglected, and mind, which is a mere reflection of sensory impressions, succumbs to the flood of objects. Thus lovers are forgotten, sorrows laid aside, death hidden from view. There is a world of accumulated feelings back of the trite, dramatic expression, "I am going away." As Carrie looked out upon the flying scenery, she almost forgot that she had been tricked into this long journey against her will, and that she was without the necessary apparel for traveling. She quite forgot Hurstwood's presence at times, and looked away to homely farmhouses and cozy cottages and villages with wondering eyes. It was an interesting world to her. Her life had just begun. She did not feel herself defeated at all. Neither was she blasted in hope. The great city held much. Possibly she would come out of bondage into freedom. Who knows? Perhaps she would be happy. These thoughts raised her above the level of erring. She was saved in that she was hopeful. The following morning the train pulled safely into Montreal, and they stepped down. Hurstwood glad to be out of danger, Carrie wondering at the novel atmosphere of the northern city. Long before, Hurstwood had been here, and now he remembered the name of the hotel at which he had stopped. As they came out of the main entrance of the depot, he heard it called anew by a busman. "We'll go right there and get rooms," he said. At the clerk's office, Hurstwood swung the register about while the clerk came forward. He was thinking what name he would put down. With the latter before him, he found no time for hesitation. A name he had seen out of the car window came swiftly to him. It was pleasing enough. With an easy hand he wrote, "G. W. Murdoch and wife." It was the largest concession to necessity he felt like making. His initials he could not spare. When they were shown to their room, Carrie saw at once that he had secured her a lovely chamber. "You have a bath here," he said. "Now you can clean up when you're ready." Carrie went over and looked out the window, while Hurstwood looked at himself in the glass. He felt dusty and unclean. He had no trunk, no change of linen, not even a hairbrush. "I'll ring for soap and towels," he said, "and send you a hairbrush. Then you can bathe and get ready for breakfast. I'll go for a shave and come back and get you, and then we'll go out and look for some clothes." He smiled good-naturedly as he said this. "All right," said Carrie. She sat down in one of the rocking chairs while Hurstwood waited for the boy, who soon knocked. "Soap, towels, and a pitcher of ice water." "Yes, sir." "I'll go now," he said to Carrie, coming toward her and holding out his hands, but she did not move to take them. "You're not mad at me, are you?" he asked softly. "Oh, no," she answered rather indifferently. "Don't you care for me at all?" She made no answer, but looked steadily toward the window.
"Don't you think you'd love me a little?" he pleaded, taking one of her hands, which she endeavored to draw away. "You once said you did." "What made you deceive me so?" asked Carrie. "I couldn't help it," he said. "I wanted you so much." "You didn't have any right to want me," she answered, striking cleanly home. "Ah, well, Carrie," he answered, "here I am. It's too late now. Won't you try and care for me a little?" He looked rather worsted in thought as he stood before her. She shook her head negatively. "Let me start all over again. Be my wife from today on." Carrie rose up as if to step away, he holding her hands. Now he slipped his arm about her, and she struggled, but in vain. He held her quite close. Instantly there flamed up in his body the all-compelling desire. His affection took an ardent form. "Let me go," said Carrie, who was folded close to him. "Won't you love me?" he said. "Won't you be mine from now on?" Carrie had never been ill-disposed toward him. Only a moment before she had been listening with some complacency, remembering her old affection for him. He was so handsome, so daring. Now, however, this feeling had changed to one of opposition, which rose feebly. It mastered her for a moment, and then, held close as she was, began to wane. Something else in her spoke. This man, to whose bosom she was being pressed, was strong. He was passionate. He loved her, and she was alone. If she did not turn to him, accept of his love, where else might she go? Her resistance half dissolved in the flood of his strong feeling. She found him lifting her head and looking into her eyes. What magnetism there was she could never know. His many sins, however, were, for the moment, all forgotten. He pressed her closer and kissed her, and she felt that further opposition was useless. "Will you marry me?" she asked, forgetting how. "This very day," he said, with all delight. Now the hall boy pounded on the door, and he released his hold upon her regretfully. "You get ready now, will you?" he said. "At once." "Yes," she answered. "I'll be back in 3/4 of an hour." Carrie, flushed and excited, moved away as he admitted the boy. Below stairs he halted in the lobby to look for a barber shop. For the moment he was in fine feather. His recent victory over Carrie seemed to atone for much he had endured during the last few days. Life seemed worth fighting for. This eastward flight from all things customary and attached seemed as if it might have happiness in store. The storm showed a rainbow at the end of which might be a pot of gold. He was about to cross to a little red and white striped bar which was fastened up beside a door, when a voice greeted him familiarly. Instantly his heart sank. "Why, hello there, George, old man," said the voice. "What are you doing here?" Hurstwood was already confronted, and recognized his friend Kenny, the stockbroker. "Just attending to a little private matter," he answered, his mind working like a keyboard of a telephone station. This man evidently did not know. He had not read the papers. "Well, it seems strange to see you way up here," said Mr. Kenny genially. "Stopping here?" "Yes," said Hurstwood uneasily, thinking of his handwriting on the register. "Going to be in town long?" "No, only a day or so." "Is that so? Had your breakfast?" "Yes," said Hurstwood, lying blandly. "I'm just going for a shave." "Won't you come for a drink?" "Not until afterwards," said the ex-manager. "I'll see you later. Are you stopping here?" "Yes," said Mr. Kenny, and then, turning the word again, added, "How are things out in Chicago?" "About the same as usual," said Hurstwood, smiling genially. "Wife with you?" "No." "Well, I must see more of you today. I'm just going in here for breakfast. Come in when you're through." "I will," said Hurstwood, moving away. The whole conversation was a trial to him. It seemed to add complications with every word. This man called up 1,000 memories. He represented everything he had left. Chicago, his wife, the elegant resort, all these were in his greeting and inquiries. And here he was in this same hotel, expecting to confer with him, unquestionably waiting to have a good time with him. All at once the Chicago papers would arrive. The local papers would have accounts in them this very day. He forgot his triumph with Carrie in the possibility of soon being known for what he was, in this man's eyes, a safe-breaker. He could have groaned as he went into the barber shop. He decided to escape and seek a more secluded hotel. Accordingly, when he came out, he was glad to see the lobby clear and hastened toward the stairs. He would get Carrie and go out by the ladies' entrance. They would have breakfast in some more inconspicuous place. Across the lobby, however, another individual was surveying him. He was of a commonplace Irish type, small of stature, cheaply dressed, and with a head that seemed a smaller edition of some huge ward politician's. This individual had evidently been talking with the clerk, but now he surveyed the ex-manager keenly. Hurstwood felt the long-range examination and recognized the type. Instinctively he felt that the man was a detective, that he was being watched. He hurried across, pretending not to notice, but in his mind was a world of thoughts. What would happen now? What could these people do? He began to trouble concerning the extradition laws. He did not understand them absolutely. Perhaps he could be arrested. Oh, if Carrie should find out! Montreal was too warm for him. He began to long to be out of it. Carrie had bathed and was waiting when he arrived. She looked refreshed, more delightful than ever, but reserved. Since he had gone, she had resumed somewhat of her cold attitude towards him. Love was not blazing in her heart. He felt it, and his troubles seemed increased. He could not take her in his arms. He did not even try. Something about her forbade it. In part his opinion was the result of his own experiences and reflections below stairs. "You're ready, are you?" he said kindly. "Yes," she answered. "We'll go out for breakfast. This place down here doesn't appeal to me very much." "All right," said Carrie. They went out, and at the corner the commonplace Irish individual was standing eyeing him. Hurstwood could scarcely refrain from showing that he knew of this chap's presence. The insolence in the fellow's eye was galling. Still they passed, and he explained to Carrie concerning the city. Another restaurant was not long in showing itself, and here they entered. "What a queer town this is," said Carrie, who marveled at it solely because it was not like Chicago. "It isn't as lively as Chicago," said Hurstwood. "Don't you like it?" "No," said Carrie, whose feelings were already localized in the great western city. "Well, it isn't as interesting," said Hurstwood. "What's here?" asked Carrie, wondering at his choosing to visit this town. "Nothing much," returned Hurstwood. "It's quite a resort. There's some pretty scenery about here." Carrie listened, but with a feeling of unrest. There was much about her situation which destroyed the possibility of appreciation. "We won't stay here long," said Hurstwood, who was now really glad to note her dissatisfaction. "You pick out your clothes as soon as breakfast is over, and we'll run down to New York soon. You'll like that. It's a lot more like a city than any place outside Chicago." He was really planning to slip out and away. He would see what these detectives would do, what move his employers at Chicago would make. Then he would slip away, down to New York, where it was easy to hide. He knew enough about that city to know that its mysteries and possibilities of mystification were infinite. The more he thought, however, the more wretched his situation became. He saw that getting here did not exactly clear up the ground. The firm would probably employ detectives to watch him, Pinkerton men or agents of Mooney and Beland. They might arrest him the moment he tried to leave Canada, so he might be compelled to remain here months, and in what a state! Back at the hotel, Hurstwood was anxious and yet fearful to see the morning papers. He wanted to know how far the news of his criminal deed had spread. So he told Carrie he would be up in a few moments, and went to secure and scan the dailies. No familiar or suspicious faces were about, and yet he did not like reading in the lobby. So he sought the main parlor on the floor above, and seated by a window there, looked them over. Very little was given to his crime, but it was there, several sticks in all. Among all the riff-raff of telegraphed murders, accidents, marriages, and other news, he wished, half sadly, that he could undo it all. Every moment of his time in this far-off abode of safety but added to his feeling that he had made a great mistake. There could have been an easier way out if he had only known. He left the papers before going to the room, thinking thus to keep them out of the hands of Carrie. "Well, how are you feeling?" he asked her. She was engaged in looking out the window. "Oh, all right," she answered. He came over and was about to begin a conversation with her when a knock came at the door. "Maybe it's one of our parcels," said Carrie. Hurstwood opened the door, outside of which stood the individual whom he had so thoroughly suspected. "You're Mr. Hurstwood, are you?" said the latter, with a volume of affected shrewdness and assurance. "Yes," said Hurstwood calmly. He knew the type so thoroughly that some of his old familiar indifference to it returned. Such men as these were the lowest stratum welcomed at the resort. He stepped out and closed the door. "Well, you know what I'm here for, don't you?" said the man confidentially. "I can guess," said Hurstwood softly. "Well, do you intend to try and keep the money?" "That's my affair," said Hurstwood grimly. "You can't do it, you know," said the detective, eyeing him coolly. "Look here, my man," said Hurstwood authoritatively, "you don't understand anything about this case, and I can't explain it to you. Whatever I intend to do, I'll do, without advice from the outside. You'll have to excuse me." "Well, now, there's no use of your talking that way," said the man. "When you're in the hands of the police, we can make a lot of trouble for you if we want to. You're not registered right in this house. You haven't got your wife with you, and the newspapers don't know you're here yet. You might as well be reasonable." "What do you want to know?" asked Hurstwood. "Whether you're gonna send the money back or not." Hurstwood paused and studied the floor. "There's no use explaining to you about this," he said at last. "There's no use of your asking me. I'm no fool, you know. I know just what you can do and what you can't. You can create a lot of trouble if you want to. I know that all right, but it won't help you get the money. Now, I've made up my mind what to do. I've already written Fitzgerald and Moy, so there's nothing I can say. You wait until you hear from them." All the time he had been talking, he had been moving away from the door, down the corridor, out of the hearing of Carrie. They were now near the end, where the corridor opened into a large general parlor. "You won't give up?" said the man. The words irritated Hurstwood greatly. Hot blood poured into his brain. Many thoughts formulated themselves. He was no thief. He didn't want the money. If he could only explain to Fitzgerald and Moy, maybe it would be all right again. "See here," he said, "there's no use my talking about this at all. I respect your power, all right, but I'll have to deal with the people who know." "Well, you can't get out of Canada with it," said the man. "I don't want to get out," said Hurstwood. "When I get ready, there will be nothing to stop me." He turned back, and the detective watched him closely. It seemed an intolerable thing. Still, he went on and into the room. "Who was it?" said Carrie. "A friend of mine from Chicago." The whole of this conversation was such a shock that, coming as it did after all the other worry of the past week, it sufficed to induce a deep gloom and moral revulsion in Hurstwood. What hurt him most was the fact that he was being pursued as a thief. He began to see the nature of that social injustice which sees but one side, often but a single point in a long tragedy. All the newspapers noted but one thing, his taking the money. How and wherefore were but indifferently dealt with. All the complications which led up to it were unknown. He was accused without being understood. Sitting in his room with Carrie the same day, he decided to send the money back. He would write Fitzgerald and Moy, explain all, and then send it by express. Maybe they would forgive him. Perhaps they would ask him back. He would make good the false statement he had made about writing them. Then he would leave this peculiar town. For an hour he thought about this plausible statement of the tangle. He wanted to tell them about his wife, but couldn't. He finally narrowed it down to an assertion that he was lightheaded from entertaining friends, had found the safe open, and having gone so far as to take the money out, had accidentally closed it. This act he regretted very much. He was sorry he had put them to so much trouble. He would undo what he could by sending the money back, the major portion of it. The remainder he would pay as soon as he could. Was there any possibility of his being restored? This he only hinted at. The troubled state of the man's mind may be judged by the very construction of this letter. For the nonce he forgot what a painful thing it would be to resume his old place, even if it were given to him. He forgot that he had severed himself from the past as by a sword, and that if he did manage to, in some way, reunite himself with it, the jagged line of separation and reunion would always show. He was always forgetting something: his wife, Carrie, his need of money, present situation, or something, and so did not reason clearly. Nevertheless, he sent the letter, waiting a reply before sending the money. Meanwhile, he accepted his present situation with Carrie, getting what joy out of it that he could. Out came the sun by noon and poured a golden flood through their open windows. Sparrows were twittering. There were laughter and song in the air. Hurstwood could not keep his eyes from Carrie. She seemed the one ray of sunshine in all his trouble. Oh, if she would only love him wholly, only throw her arms around him in the blissful spirit in which he had seen her in the little park in Chicago, how happy he would be! It would repay him. It would show him that he had not lost all. He would not care. "Carrie," he said, getting up once and coming over to her, "are you going to stay with me from now on?" She looked at him quizzically, but melted with sympathy as the value of the look upon his face forced itself upon her. It was love now, keen and strong, love enhanced by difficulty and worry. She could not help smiling. "Let me be everything to you from now on," he said. "Don't make me worry any more. I'll be true to you. We'll go to New York and get a nice flat. I'll go into business again, and we'll be happy. Won't you be mine?" Carrie listened quite solemnly. There was no great passion in her, but the drift of things, and this man's proximity, created a semblance of affection. She felt rather sorry for him, a sorry born of what had only recently been a great admiration. True love she had never felt for him. She would have known as much if she could have analyzed her feelings. But this thing which she now felt, aroused by his great feeling, broke down the barriers between them. "You'll stay with me, won't you?" he asked. "Yes," she said, nodding her head. He gathered her to himself, imprinting kisses upon her lips and cheek. "You must marry me, though," she said. "I'll get the license today," he answered. "How?" she asked. "Under a new name," he answered. "I'll take a new name and live a new life. From now on I'm Murdoch." "Oh, don't take that name," said Carrie. "Why not?" he said. "I don't like it." "Well, what shall I take?" he asked. "Oh, anything, only don't take that." He thought a while, still keeping his arms about her, and then said, "How about Wheeler?" "That's all right," said Carrie. "Well, then, Wheeler," he said. "I'll get the license this afternoon." They were married by a Baptist minister, the first divine they found convenient. At last the Chicago firm answered. It was by Mr. Moy's dictation. He was astonished that Hurstwood had done this, very sorry that it had come about as it had. If the money were returned, they would not trouble to prosecute him, as they really bore him no ill will. As for his returning, or their restoring him to his former position, they had not quite decided what the effect of it would be. They would think it over and correspond with him later, possibly after a little time, and so on. The sum and substance of it was that there was no hope. and they wanted the money with the least trouble possible. Hurstwood read his doom. He decided to pay $9,500 to the agent whom they said they would send, keeping $1,300 for his own use. He telegraphed his acquiescence, explained to the representative who called at the hotel the same day, took a certificate of payment, and told Carrie to pack her trunk. He was slightly depressed over this newest move at the time he began to make it, but eventually restored himself. He feared that even yet he might be seized and taken back, so he tried to conceal his movements, but it was scarcely possible. He ordered Carrie's trunk sent to the depot, where he had it sent by express to New York. No one seemed to be observing him, but he left at night. He was greatly agitated lest at the first station across the border, or at the depot in New York, there should be waiting for him an officer of the law. Carrie, ignorant of his theft and his fears, enjoyed the entry into the latter city in the morning. The round green hills, sentineling the broad, expansive bosom of the Hudson, held her attention by their beauty as the train followed the line of the stream. She had heard of the Hudson River, the great city of New York, and now she looked out, filling her mind with the wonder of it. As the train turned east at Spuyten Duyvil and followed the east bank of the Harlem River, Hurstwood nervously called her attention to the fact that they were on the edge of the city. After her experience with Chicago, she expected a long line of cars, a great highway of tracks, and noticed the difference. The sight of a few boats in the Harlem and more in the East River tickled her young heart. It was the first sign of the great sea. Next came a plain street with 5-story brick flats, and then the train plunged into the tunnel. "Grand Central Station," called the trainman, as after a few minutes of darkness and smoke daylight reappeared. Hurstwood arose and gathered up his small grip. "Grand Central Station," called the trainman, as after a few minutes of darkness and smoke daylight reappeared. Hurstwood arose and gathered up his small grip. He was screwed up to the highest tension. With Carrie he waited at the door and then dismounted. No one approached him, but he glanced furtively to and fro as he made for the street entrance. So excited was he that he forgot all about Carrie, who fell behind, wondering at his self-absorption. As he passed through the depot proper, the strain reached its climax and began to wane. All at once he was on the sidewalk, and none but cabmen hailed him. He heaved a great breath and turned, remembering Carrie. "I thought you were going to run off and leave me," she said. "I was trying to remember which car takes us to the Gilsey," he answered. Carrie hardly heard him, so interested was she in the busy scene. "How large is New York?" she asked. "Oh, 1,000,000 or more," said Hurstwood. He looked around and hailed a cab, but he did so in a changed way. For the first time in years the thought that he must count these little expenses flashed through his mind. It was a disagreeable thing. He decided he would lose no time living in hotels, but would rent a flat. Accordingly he told Carrie, and she agreed. "We'll look today if you want to," she said. Suddenly he thought of his experience in Montreal. At the more important hotels he would be certain to meet Chicagoans whom he knew. He stood up and spoke to the driver. "Take me to the Bedford," he said, knowing it would be less frequented by those whom he knew. Then he sat down. "Where is the residence part?" said Carrie, who did not take the tall 5-story walls on either hand to be the abodes of families. "Everywhere," said Hurstwood, who knew the city fairly well. "There are no lawns in New York. All these are houses." "Well, then, I don't like it," said Carrie, who was coming to have a few opinions of her own. End of chapter 29. Recording by Bob Sage. Chapter 30 of Sister Carrie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bob Sage. Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. Chapter 30. The Kingdom of Greatness, The Pilgrim a Dream. Whatever a man like Herstwood would be in Chicago, it is very evident that he would be but an inconspicuous drop in an ocean like New York. In Chicago, whose population still ranged about 500,000, millionaires were not numerous. The rich had not become so conspicuously rich as to drown all moderate incomes in obscurity. The attention of the inhabitants was not so distracted by local celebrities in the dramatic, artistic, social, and religious fields as to shut the well-positioned man from view. In Chicago, the two roads to distinction were politics and trade. In New York, the roads were any one of 100, and each had been diligently pursued by hundreds, so that celebrities were numerous. The sea was already full of whales. A common fish must needs disappear wholly from view, remain unseen. In other words, Herstwood was nothing. There is a more subtle result of such a situation as this, which, though not always taken into account, produces tragedies of the world. The great create an atmosphere which reacts badly upon the small. This atmosphere is easily and quickly felt. Walk among the magnificent residences, the splendid equipages, the gilded shops, restaurants, resorts of all kind. Scent the flowers, the silks, the wines. Drink of the laughter springing from the soul of luxurious content, of the glances which gleam like faint light from defiant spears. Feel the quality of the smiles which cut like glistening swords, and of strides born of place, and you shall know of what is the atmosphere of the high and mighty. Little use to argue that of such is not the kingdom of greatness, but so long as the world is attracted by this, and the human heart views this as the one desirable realm which it must attain, so long to the heart will this remain the realm of greatness. So long also will the atmosphere of this realm work its desperate results in the soul of man. It is like a chemical reagent. One day of it, like one drop of the other, will so affect and discolor the views, the aims, the desire of the mind, that it will thereafter remain forever dyed. A day of it to the untried mind is like opium to the untried body. A craving is set up which, if gratified, shall eternally result in dreams and death, aye, dreams unfulfilled, gnawing, luring, idle phantoms which beckon and lead, until death and dissolution dissolve their power and restore us blind to nature's heart. A man of Herstwood's age and temperament is not subject to the illusions and burning desires of youth, but neither has he the strength of hope which gushes as a fountain in the heart of youth. Such an atmosphere could not incite in him the cravings of a boy of 18, but in so far as they were excited, the lack of hope made them proportionately bitter. He could not fail to notice the signs of affluence and luxury on every hand. He had been to New York before, and knew the resources of its folly. In part it was an awesome place to him, for here gathered all that he most respected on this earth: wealth, place, and fame. The majority of celebrities with whom he had tipped glasses in his day as manager hailed from this self-centered and populous spot. The most inviting stories of pleasure and luxury had been told of places and individuals here. He knew it to be true that unconsciously he was brushing elbows with fortune the livelong day, that 100 or 500,000 gave no one the privilege of living more than comfortably in so wealthy a place. Fashion and pomp required more ample sums, so that the poor man was nowhere. All this he realized, now quite sharply, as he faced the city, cut off from his friends, despoiled of his modest fortune and even his name, and forced to begin the battle for place and comfort all over again. He was not old, but he was not so dull but that he could feel he soon would be. Of a sudden, then, this show of fine clothes, place, and power took
took on peculiar significance. It was emphasized by contrast with his own distressed state. And it was distressing. He soon found that freedom from fear of arrest was not the sine qua non of his existence. The danger dissolved. The next necessity became the grievous thing. The paltry sum of 1,300 and some odd dollars set against the need of rent, clothing, food, and pleasure for years to come was a spectacle little calculated to induce peace of mind in one who had been accustomed to spend 5 times that sum in the course of a year. He thought upon this subject rather actively the first few days he was in New York, and decided that he must act quickly. As a consequence, he consulted the business opportunities advertised in the morning papers and began investigations on his own account. That was not before he had become settled, however. Carrie and he went looking for a flat, as arranged, and found one in 78th Street, near Amsterdam Avenue. It was a 5-story building, and their flat was on the 3rd floor. Owing to the fact that the street was not yet built up solidly, it was possible to see east to the green tops of the trees in Central Park, and west to the broad waters of the Hudson, a glimpse of which was to be had out of the west windows. For the privilege of 6 rooms and a bath, running in a straight line, they were compelled to pay $35 a month, an average and yet exorbitant rent for a home at the time. Carrie noticed the difference between the size of the rooms here and in Chicago, and mentioned it. "You'll not find anything better, dear," said Hurstwood, "unless you go into one of the old-fashioned houses, and then you won't have any of these conveniences." Carrie picked out the new abode because of its newness and bright woodwork. It was one of the very new ones supplied with steam heat, which was a great advantage. The stationary range, hot and cold water, dumb waiter, speaking tubes, and call bell for the janitor pleased her very much. She had enough of the instincts of a housewife to take great satisfaction in these things. Hurstwood made arrangement with one of the installment houses where they furnished the flat complete, and accepted $50 down and $10 a month. He then had a little plate, bearing the name G. W. Wheeler, made, which he placed on his letter box in the hall. It sounded exceedingly odd to Carrie to be called Mrs. Wheeler by the janitor, but in time she became used to it, and looked upon the name as her own. These house details settled, Hurstwood visited some of the advertised opportunities to purchase an interest in some flourishing downtown bar. After the palatial resort in Adams Street, he could not stomach the commonplace saloons which he found advertised. He lost a number of days looking up these and finding them disagreeable. He did, however, gain considerable knowledge by talking, for he discovered the influence of Tammany Hall and the value of standing in with the police. The most profitable and flourishing places he found to be those which conducted anything but a legitimate business, such as that controlled by Fitzgerald and Moy. Elegant back rooms and private drinking booths on the 2nd floor were usually adjuncts of a very profitable place. He saw by portly keepers, whose shirt fronts shone with large diamonds, and whose clothes were properly cut, that the liquor business here, as elsewhere, yielded the same golden profit. At last he found an individual who had a resort in Warren Street, which seemed an excellent venture. It was fairly well appearing and susceptible of improvement. The owner claimed the business to be excellent, and it certainly looked so. "We deal with a very good class of people," he told Hurstwood. "Merchants, salesmen, and professionals. It's a well-dressed class. No bums. We don't allow 'em in the place." Hurstwood listened to the cash register ring and watched the trade for a while. "It's profitable enough for 2, is it?" he asked. "You can see for yourself if you're any judge of the liquor trade," said the owner. "This is only one of 2 places I have. The other is down in Nassau Street. I can't tend them both alone. If I had someone who knew the business thoroughly, I wouldn't mind sharing with him in this one and let him manage the other." "I've had experience enough," said Hurstwood blandly, but he felt a little diffident about referring to Fitzgerald and Moy. "Well, you can suit yourself, Mr. Wheeler. said the proprietor. He only offered a third interest in the stock, fixtures, and goodwill, and this in return for $1,000 in managerial ability on the part of the one who should come in. There was no property involved because the owner of the saloon merely rented from an estate. The offer was genuine enough, but it was a question with Hurstwood whether a third interest in that locality could be made to yield $150 a month, which he figured he must have in order to meet the ordinary family expenses and be comfortable. It was not the time, however, after many failures to find what he wanted, to hesitate. It looked as though a third would pay $100 a month now. By judicious management and improvement, it might be made to pay more. Accordingly, he agreed to enter into partnership and made over his $1,000, preparing to enter the next day. His first inclination was to be elated, and he confided to Carrie that he thought he had made an excellent arrangement. Time, however, introduced food for reflection. He found his partner to be very disagreeable. Frequently he was the worse for liquor, which made him surly. This was the last thing which Hurstwood was used to in business. Besides, the business varied. It was nothing like the class of patronage which he had enjoyed in Chicago. He found that it would take a long time to make friends. These people hurried in and out without seeking the pleasures of friendship. It was no gathering or lounging place. Whole days and weeks passed without one such hearty greeting as he had been wont to enjoy every day in Chicago. For another thing, Hurstwood missed celebrities, those well-dressed, elite individuals who lend grace to the average bars and bring news from far-off and exclusive circles. He did not see one such in a month. Evenings, when still at his post, he would occasionally read in the evening papers incidents concerning celebrities he knew, whom he had drunk a glass with many a time. They would visit a bar like Fitzgerald and Moy's in Chicago or the Hoffman House uptown, but he knew that he would never see them down here. Again, the business did not pay as well as he thought. It increased a little, but he found he would have to watch his household expenses, which was humiliating. At the very beginning it was a delight to come home late at night, as he did, and find Carrie. He managed to run up and take dinner with her between 6 and 7, and to remain home until 9 o'clock in the morning. But the novelty of this waned after a time, and he began to feel the drag of his duties. The first month had scarcely passed before Carrie said, in a very natural way, "I think I'll go down this week and buy a dress." "What kind?" said Hurstwood. "Oh, something for street wear." "All right," he said, smiling, although he noted mentally that it would be more agreeable to his finances if she didn't. Nothing was said about it the next day, but the following morning he asked, "Have you done anything about your dress?" "Not yet," said Carrie. He paused a few moments, as if in thought, and then he said, "Would you mind putting it off a few days?" "No," replied Carrie, who did not catch the drift of his remarks. She had never thought of him in connection with money troubles before. "Why?" "Well, I'll tell you," said Hurstwood. "This investment of mine is taking a lot of money just now. I expect to get it all back shortly, but just at present I'm running close." "Oh," answered Carrie. "Why, certainly, dear. Why didn't you tell me before?" "It wasn't necessary," said Hurstwood. For all her acquiescence, there was something about the way Hurstwood spoke which reminded Carrie of Drouet, and his little deal which he was always about to put through. It was only the thought of a second, but it was a beginning. It was something new in her thinking of Hurstwood. Other things followed from time to time, little things of the same sort, which in their cumulative effect were eventually equal to a full revelation. Carrie was not dull, by any means. Two persons cannot long dwell together without coming to an understanding of one another. The mental difficulties of an individual reveal themselves whether he voluntarily confesses them or not. Trouble gets in the air and contributes gloom, which speaks for itself. Hurstwood dressed as nicely as usual, but they were the same clothes he had in Canada. Carrie noticed that he did not install a large wardrobe, though his own was anything but large. She noticed also that he did not suggest many amusements, said nothing about the food, seemed concerned about his business. This was not the easy Hurstwood of Chicago, not the liberal, opulent Hurstwood she had known. The change was too obvious to escape detection. In time she began to feel that a change had come about and that she was not in his confidence. He was evidently secretive and kept his own counsel. She found herself asking him questions about little things. This is a disagreeable state to a woman. Great love makes it seem reasonable, sometimes plausible, but never satisfactory. Where great love is not, a more definite and less satisfactory conclusion is reached. As for Hurstwood, he was making a great fight against the difficulties of a changed condition. He was too shrewd not to realize the tremendous mistake he had made, and appreciate that he had done well in getting where he was. And yet he could not help contrasting his present state with his former, hour after hour, and day after day. Besides, he had the disagreeable fear of meeting old friends, ever since one such encounter which he made shortly after his arrival in the city. It was in Broadway that he saw a man approaching him whom he knew. There was no time for simulating non-recognition. The exchange of glances had been too sharp, the knowledge of each other too apparent. So the friend, a buyer for one of the Chicago wholesale houses, felt perforce the necessity of stopping. "How are you?" he said, extending his hand with an evident mixture of feeling and a lack of plausible interest. "Very well," said Hurstwood, equally embarrassed. "How is it with you?" "I'm all right. I'm down here doing a little buying. Are you located here now?" "Yes," said Hurstwood. "I have a place down in Warren Street." "Is that so?" said the friend. "Glad to hear it. I'll come down and see you." "Do," said Hurstwood. "So long," said the other man, smiling affably and going on. "He never asked for my number," thought Hurstwood. "He wouldn't think of coming." He wiped his forehead, which had grown damp, and hoped sincerely that he would meet no one else. These things told upon his good nature, such as it was. His one hope was that things would change for the better in a money way. He had Carrie. His furniture was being paid for. He was maintaining his position. As for Carrie, the amusements he could give her would have to do for the present. He could probably keep up his pretensions sufficiently long without exposure to make good, and then all would be well. He failed therein to take account of the frailties of human nature, the difficulties of matrimonial life. Carrie was young. With him and with her, varying mental states were common. Any moment the extremes of feeling might be antipolarized at the dinner table. This often happens in the best regulated families. Little things brought out on such occasions need great love to obliterate them afterward. Where that is not, both parties count 2 and 2 and make a problem for a while. End of chapter 30. Recording by Bob Sage.
Chapter 31 of Sister Carrie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Roger Moline. Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. Chapter 31. A Pet of Good Fortune. Broadway flaunts its joys. The effect of the city and his own situation on Hurstwood was paralleled in the case of Carrie, who accepted the things fortune provided with the most genial good nature. New York, despite her first expression of disapproval, soon interested her exceedingly. Its clear atmosphere, more populous thoroughfares, and peculiar indifference struck her forcibly. She had never seen such a little flat as hers, and yet it soon enlisted her affection. The new furniture made an excellent showing. The sideboard, which Hurstwood himself arranged, gleamed brightly. The furniture for each room was appropriate, and in the so-called parlor, or front room, was installed a piano, because Carrie said she would like to learn to play. She kept a servant, and developed rapidly in household tactics and information. For the first time in her life she felt settled, and somewhat justified in the eyes of society, as she conceived of it. Her thoughts were merry and innocent enough. For a long while she concerned herself over the arrangement of New York flats, and wondered at 10 families living in one building, and all remaining strange and indifferent to each other. She also marveled at the whistles of the hundreds of vessels in the harbor, the long, low cries of the sound steamers and ferry boats when fog was on. The mere fact that these things spoke from the sea made them wonderful. She looked much at what she could see of the Hudson from her west windows, and of the great city building up rapidly on either hand. It was much to ponder over, and sufficed to entertain her for more than a year, without becoming stale. For another thing, Hurstwood was exceedingly interesting in his affection for her. Troubled as he was, he never exposed his difficulties to her. He carried himself with the same self-important air, took his new state with easy familiarity, and rejoiced in Carrie's proclivities and successes. Each evening he arrived promptly to dinner, and found the little dining-room a most inviting spectacle. In a way, the smallness of the room added to its luxury. It looked full and replete. The white-covered table was arrayed with pretty dishes, and lighted with a 4-armed candelabra, each light of which was topped with a red shade. Between Carrie and the girl, the steaks and chops came out all right, and canned goods did the rest for a while. Carrie studied the art of making biscuit, and soon reached the stage where she could show a plate of light, palatable morsels for her labor. In this manner the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th months passed. Winter came, and with it a feeling that indoors was best, so that the attending of theaters was not much talked of. Hurstwood made great efforts to meet all expenditures without a show of feeling one way or the other. He pretended that he was reinvesting his money in strengthening the business for greater ends in the future. He contented himself with a very moderate allowance of personal apparel, and rarely suggested anything for Carrie. Thus the first winter passed. In the 2nd year, the business which Hurstwood managed did increase somewhat. He got out of it regularly the $150 per month which he had anticipated. Unfortunately, by this time Carrie had reached certain conclusions, and he had scraped up a few acquaintances. Being of a passive and receptive rather than an active and aggressive nature, Carrie accepted the situation. Her state seemed satisfactory enough. Once in a while they would go to a theater together, occasionally, in season, to the beaches and different points about the city, but they picked up no acquaintances. Hurstwood naturally abandoned his show of fine manners with her, and modified his attitude to one of easy familiarity. There were no misunderstandings, no apparent differences of opinion. In fact, without money or visiting friends, he led a life which could neither arouse jealousy nor comment. Carrie rather sympathized with his efforts, and thought nothing upon her lack of entertainment such as she had enjoyed in Chicago. New York, as a corporate entity, and her flat, temporarily seemed sufficient. However, as Hurstwood's business increased, he, as stated, began to pick up acquaintances. He also began to allow himself more clothes. He convinced himself that his home life was very precious to him, but allowed that he could occasionally stay away from dinner. The first time he did this, he sent a message saying that he would be detained. Carrie ate alone, and wished that it might not happen again. The second time, also, he sent word, but at the last moment. The third time he forgot entirely, and explained afterwards. These events were months apart each. "Where were you, George?" asked Carrie after the first absence. "Tied up at the office," he said genially. "There were some accounts I had to straighten." "I'm sorry you couldn't get home," she said kindly. "I was fixin' to have such a nice dinner." The second time he gave a similar excuse, but the third time the feeling about it in Carrie's mind was a little bit out of the ordinary. "I couldn't get home," he said, when he came home later in the evening. "I was so busy." "Couldn't you have sent me word?" asked Carrie. "I meant to," he said, "but I forgot about it until it was too late to do any good." "And I had such a good dinner," said Carrie. Now, it so happened that from his observations of Carrie, he began to imagine that she was of the thoroughly domestic type of mind. He really thought, after a year, that her chief expression in life was finding its natural channel in household duties. Notwithstanding the fact that he had observed her act in Chicago, and that during the past year he had only seen her limited in her relations to her flat and him by conditions which he made, and that she had not gained any friends or associates, he drew this peculiar conclusion. With it came a feeling of satisfaction in having a wife who could thus be content, and this satisfaction worked its natural result. That is, since he imagined he saw her satisfied, he felt called upon to give only that which contributed to such satisfaction. He supplied the furniture, the decorations, the food, and the necessary clothing. Thoughts of entertaining her, or leading her out into the shine and show of life, grew less and less. He felt attracted to the outer world, but did not think she would care to go along. Once he went to the theater alone. Another time he joined a couple of his new friends at an evening game of poker. Since his money feathers were beginning to grow again, he felt like sprucing about. All this, however, in a much less imposing way than had been his wont in Chicago. He avoided the gay places where he would be apt to meet those who had known him. Now, Carrie began to feel this in various sensory ways. She was not the kind to be seriously disturbed by his actions. Not loving him greatly, she could not be jealous in a disturbing way. In fact, she was not jealous at all. Hurstwood was pleased with her placid manner, when he should have duly considered it. When he did not come home, it did not seem anything like a terrible thing to her. She gave him credit for having the usual allurements of men, people to talk to, places to stop, friends to consult with. She was perfectly willing that he should enjoy himself in this way, but she did not care to be neglected herself. Her state still seemed fairly reasonable, however. All she did observe was that Hurstwood was somewhat different. Sometime in the second year of their residence in 78th Street, the flat across the hall from Carrie became vacant, and into it moved a very handsome young woman and her husband, with both of whom Carrie afterwards became acquainted. This was brought about solely by the arrangement of the flats, which were united in one place, as it were, by the dumbwaiter. This useful elevator, by which fuel, groceries, and the like were sent up from the basement, and garbage and waste were sent down, was used by both residents on one floor. That is, a small door opened into it from each flat. If the occupants of both flats answered to the whistle of the janitor at the same time, they would stand face to face when they opened the dumbwaiter doors. One morning, when Carrie went to remove her paper, the newcomer, a handsome brunette of perhaps 23 years of age, was there for a like purpose. She was in a night robe and dressing gown, with her hair very much tousled, but she looked so pretty and good-natured that Carrie instantly conceived a liking for her. The newcomer did no more than smile shamefacedly, but it was sufficient. Carrie felt that she would like to know her, and a similar feeling stirred in the mind of the other, who admired Carrie's innocent face. "That's a real pretty woman who has moved in next door," said Carrie to Hurstwood at the breakfast table. "Who are they?" asked Hurstwood. "I don't know," said Carrie. "The name on the bell is Vance. Someone over there plays beautifully. I guess it must be she." "Well, you never can tell what sort of people you're living next to in this town, can you?" said Hurstwood, expressing the customary New York opinion about neighbors. "Just think," said Carrie. "I've been in this house with 9 other families for over a year, and I don't know a soul. These people have been here over a month, and I haven't seen anyone before this morning." "It's just as well," said Hurstwood. "You never know who you're going to get in with. Some of these people are pretty bad company." "I expect so," said Carrie agreeably. The conversation turned to other things, and Carrie thought no more upon the subject until a day or two later, when, going out to market, she encountered Mrs. Vance coming in. The latter recognized her and nodded, for which Carrie returned a smile. This settled the probability of acquaintanceship. If there had been no faint recognition on this occasion, there would have been no future association. Carrie saw no more of Mrs. Vance for several weeks, but she heard her play through the thin walls which divided the front rooms of the flats, and was pleased by the merry selection of pieces and the brilliance of their rendition. She could play only moderately herself, and such variety as Mrs. Vance exercised bordered, for Carrie, upon the verge of great art. Everything she had seen and heard thus far, the merest scraps and shadows, indicated that these people were, in a measure, refined and in comfortable circumstances. So Carrie was ready for any extension of the friendships which might follow. One day Carrie's bell rang, and the servant, who was in the kitchen, pressed the button which caused the front door of the general entrance on the ground floor to be electrically unlatched. When Carrie waited at her own door on the 3rd floor to see who it might be coming up to call on her, Mrs. Vance appeared. "I hope you'll excuse me," she said. "I went out a while ago and forgot my outside key, so I thought I'd ring your bell." This was a common trick of other residents of the building whenever they'd forgotten their outside keys. They did not apologize for it, however. "Certainly," said Carrie. "I'm glad you did. I do the same thing sometimes." "Isn't it just delightful weather?" said Mrs. Vance, pausing for a moment. Thus, after a few more preliminaries, this visiting acquaintance was well launched, and in the young Mrs. Vance, Carrie found an agreeable companion. On several occasions, Carrie visited her and was visited. Both flats were good to look upon, though that of the Vances tended somewhat more to the luxurious. "I want you to come over this evening and meet my husband," said Mrs. Vance, not long after their intimacy began. "He wants to meet you. You play cards, don't you?" "A little," said Carrie. "Well, we'll have a game of cards. If your husband comes home, bring him over." "He's not coming to dinner tonight," said Carrie. "Well, when he does come, we'll call him in." Carrie acquiesced, and that evening met the portly Vance, an individual a few years younger than Hurstwood, and who owed his seemingly comfortable matrimonial state much more to his money than to his good looks. He thought well of Carrie upon the first glance, and laid himself out to be genial, teaching her a new game of cards and talking to her about New York and its pleasures. Mrs. Vance played some upon the piano, and at last Hurstwood came. "I am very glad to meet you," he said to Mrs. Vance when Carrie introduced him, showing much of the old grace which had captivated Carrie. "Did you think your wife had run away?" said Mr. Vance, extending his hand upon introduction. "I didn't know but what she might have found a better husband," said Hurstwood. He now turned his attention to Mrs. Vance, and in a flash Carrie saw again what she for some time had subconsciously missed in Hurstwood, the adroitness and flattery of which he was capable. She also saw that she was not well dressed, not nearly as well dressed as Mrs. Vance. These were not vague ideas any longer. Her situation was cleared up for her. She felt that her life was becoming stale, and therein she felt cause for gloom. The old helpful, urging melancholy was restored. The desirous Carrie was whispered to concerning her possibilities. There were no immediate results to this awakening, for Carrie had little power of initiative, but nevertheless she seemed ever capable of getting herself into the tide of change where she would be easily borne along. Hurstwood noticed nothing. He had been unconscious of the marked contrast which Carrie had observed. He did not even detect the shade of melancholy which settled in her eyes. Worst of all, she now began to feel the loneliness of the flat and seek the company of Mrs. Vance, who liked her exceedingly. "Let's go to the matinee this afternoon," said Mrs. Vance, who had stepped across into Carrie's flat one morning, still arrayed in a soft pink dressing gown, which she had donned upon rising. Hurstwood and Vance had gone their separate ways nearly an hour before. "All right," said Carrie, noticing the air of the petted and well-groomed woman in Mrs. Vance's general appearance. She looked as though she was dearly loved and her every wish gratified. "What shall we see?" "Oh, I do want to see Nat Goodwin," said Mrs. Vance. "I do think he is the jolliest actor. The papers say this is such a good play." "What time will we have to start?" asked Carrie. "Let's go at 1 and walk down Broadway from 34th Street," said Mrs. Vance. "It's such an interesting walk. He's at the Madison Square." "I'll be glad to go," said Carrie. "How much will we have to pay for seats?" "Not more than $1," said Mrs. Vance. The latter departed, and at 1 o'clock reappeared, stunningly arrayed in a dark blue walking dress, with a knobby hat to match. Carrie had gotten herself up charmingly enough, but this woman pained her by contrast. She seemed to have so many dainty little things which Carrie had not. There were trinkets of gold, an elegant green leather purse set with her initials, a fancy handkerchief exceedingly rich in design, and the like. Carrie felt that she needed more and better clothes to compare with this woman, and that anyone looking at the two would pick Mrs. Vance for her raiment alone. It was a trying, though rather unjust thought, for Carrie had now developed an equally pleasing figure, and had grown in comeliness until it was a thoroughly attractive type of her color of beauty. There was some difference in the clothing of the two, both of quality and age, but this difference was not especially noticeable. It served, however, to augment Carrie's dissatisfaction with her state. The walk down Broadway, then as now, was one of the remarkable features of the city. There gathered, before the matinee and afterwards, not only all the pretty women who loved a showy parade, but the men who loved to gaze upon and admire them. It was a very imposing procession of pretty faces and fine clothes. Women appeared in their very best hats, shoes, and gloves, and walked arm in arm on their way to the fine shops or theaters strung along from 14th to 34th Streets. Equally, the men paraded with the very latest they could afford. A tailor might have secured hints on suit measurements, a shoemaker on proper lasts and colors, a hatter on hats. It was literally true that if a lover of fine clothes secured a new suit, it was sure to have its first airing on Broadway. So true and well understood was this fact that several years later a popular song, detailing this and other facts concerning the afternoon parade on matinee days, and entitled "What Right Has He on Broadway?" was published, and had quite a vogue about the music halls of the city. In all her stay in the city, Carrie had never heard of this showy parade, had never even been on Broadway when it was taking place. On the other hand, It was a familiar thing to Mrs. Vance, who not only knew of it as an entity, but had often been in it, going purposely to see and be seen, to create a stir with her beauty and dispel any tendency to fall short in dressiness by contrasting herself with the beauty and fashion of the town. Carrie stepped along easily enough after they got out of the car at 34th Street, but soon fixed her eyes upon the lovely company which swarmed by and with them as they proceeded. She noticed suddenly that Mrs. Vance's manner had rather stiffened under the gaze of handsome men and elegantly dressed ladies, whose glances were not modified by any rules of propriety. To stare seemed the proper and natural thing. Carrie found herself stared at and ogled. Men in flawless top-coats, high hats, and silver-headed walking sticks elbowed near and looked too often into conscious eyes. Ladies rustled by in dresses of stiff cloth, shedding affected smiles and perfume. Carrie noticed among them the sprinkling of goodness and the heavy percentage of vice. The rouged and powdered cheeks and lips, the scented hair, the large, misty, and languorous eye were common enough. With a start she awoke to find that she was in fashion's crowd, on parade in a show place, and such a show place. Jewelers' windows gleamed along the path with remarkable frequency. Florist shops, furriers, haberdashers, confectioners, all followed in rapid succession. The street was full of coaches. Pompous doormen in immense coats, shiny brass belts and buttons, waited in front of expensive salesrooms. Coachmen in tan boots, white tails, and blue jackets waited obsequiously for the mistresses of carriages who were shopping inside. The whole street bore the flavor of riches and show, and Carrie felt that she was not of it. She could not, for the life of her, assume the attitude and smartness of Mrs. Vance, who, in her beauty, was all assurance. She could only imagine that it must be evident to many that she was the less handsomely dressed of the two. It cut her to the quick, and she resolved that she would not come here again until she looked better. At the same time, she longed to feel the delight of parading here as an equal. Ah, then she would be happy. End of chapter 31. Recording by Roger Moline.